A man is mopping a hallway. That's all. Just a man, a mop. The slow back and forth of someone who has made himself into furniture, into background, into the kind of person nobody looks at twice. He has been mopping this same hallway for 3 years. What? Nobody in this building knows what nobody anywhere knows. Because he made sure of that is that this man once dismantled a terrorist network in 12 minutes with nothing but a blade and a set of decisions most people couldn't make in a lifetime. His phone buzzes. He stops. One photograph. His daughter, standing outside her university, smiling at something on her screen, completely unaware of the man in the dark jacket standing 15 meters behind her, watching. Below the photo, 4 words. We're not finished, Anthony. 3 years of silence. 3 years of invisible. 3 years of believing that small was the same thing as safe. Gone, just like that. The mop handle was splitting along the grain. Had been for 2 weeks. Anthony Wilson kept meaning to ask the supply closet guy, Darnell. The heavy-set man who smelled like menthol cigarettes and always had a word search book open on his phone for a replacement. He never did, not because he forgot. Because asking for things meant talking to someone. Talking to someone meant being remembered. And being remembered was the one luxury Anthony Wilson could not afford. He pushed the mop across the linoleum in long, even strokes. The hallway of Ridgeline Middle School smelled like cafeteria grease and cheap industrial cleaner, and underneath both of those, the particular stale warmth of a building that held 600 kids for 8 hours a day. You stopped noticing the smell after 20 minutes. What you never stopped noticing was the sound. The squeak of sneakers on wet floors. The percussion of lockers. The constant overlapping noise of adolescents who had not yet learned that the world did not need to hear every single thought the moment it arrived. He didn't hate it. That surprised him. Every single day for 3 years it surprised him. At 4:47 in the afternoon, the building had mostly emptied out. A few teachers still in their rooms, staring at laptops with the glazed expression of people who had been looking at the same document for so long that the words had stopped connecting to anything. The janitor's cart squeaked around the corner toward the east wing. Bathrooms, which were always the worst. 12-year-old boys had a relationship with hygiene that Anthony found genuinely baffling, and he'd spent time in environments where hygiene was the least of anyone's concerns. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He ignored it, probably the automated reminder from Vanessa's university app. She had a studio critique on Friday, and the system liked to send 3 reminders about upcoming assessments, as if adults were incapable of tracking time without being nudged every 48 hours. Anthony found the app mildly irritating, but had never turned off the notifications because Vanessa liked knowing he got them. It was a small thing. He kept the small things. The phone buzzed again. He stopped the cart outside the bathroom door, pulled the phone from his pocket, looked at the screen, not the university app. Unknown number, no contact name, no area code he recognized. Just a string of digits that looked almost right, almost familiar. The kind of number you got when someone was routing through a spoofed line, cycling the signal through 3 different relays before it ever touched a cell tower. Anthony had not seen a spoofed number in 3 years. But the pattern recognition didn't go away just because you wanted it to. You didn't unlearn that kind of thing. It lived somewhere below conscious thought, the same part of his brain that still made him sit with his back to the wall in every restaurant, still made him clock every exit when he walked into a room, still woke him up at 3:00 in the morning sometimes, for no reason he could name, except that his body had decided the night required supervision. He opened the message. One photograph. Vanessa standing on the sidewalk outside the Hartwell Library at Denver University, her backpack hanging off one shoulder, her headphones around her neck. She was looking at something on her phone, half smiling at whatever she'd just read, completely unaware of anything around her. The photo was taken from a distance, maybe 40-50 feet, long lens or a good zoom. Whoever held the camera had been standing near the row of parked cars along the curb, and in the background, barely visible but unmistakably there, a man in a dark jacket was leaning. against a telephone pole. Not looking at his phone, not talking to anyone, just standing, just watching, weight balanced, not actually leaning into the pole so much as resting against it. The specific way you learned to stand when you needed to look casual while remaining ready to move. Military background, law enforcement, both. Anthony had stood that way himself more times than he could count. Below the photo, one line of text. "We're not finished, Anthony." He read it twice. Not because he didn't understand it, because he needed his brain to finish processing before his hands did something automatic. That was the old training surfacing. Read it again, breathe through it, then act. He put the phone in his pocket, left the mop cart exactly where it was in the middle of the hallway, walked to the parking lot. Didn't say anything to anyone on the way out, because there was no one in his immediate path, and even if there had been, he would have found a reason not to stop. The Honda Civic sat at the far end of the lot where he always parked. 2009. Dent in the rear bumper from a parking lot incident he'd never reported, because reporting things meant paperwork, and paperwork meant records. Check engine light had been on for so long he'd genuinely stopped seeing it. He'd bought the car with cash from a private seller in his first month in Denton, because it was the kind of car that nobody looked at twice. He'd done the same with the apartment's second floor of a 6-unit building on a quiet street, landlord who cashed his checks and otherwise operated as if Anthony didn't exist. He'd done the same with every single component of the life he'd built here. Each choice calibrated for the smallest possible footprint. He drove the 4 miles to Denver University in 5 minutes, which was faster than the posted limit technically allowed, and pulled up across the street from the Hartwell Library just as the last of the late afternoon crowd was dispersing. He kept the engine running and scanned the sidewalk, the parked cars, the corner, the bus stop halfway down the block. No man in a dark jacket. Vanessa was standing near the library steps, talking to her friend Kimberly Taylor. Kimberly had box braids and a laugh that carried half a block even through a closed car window. The two of them were doing the thing they always did at the end of a conversation. Both of them half turned to leave, but neither one actually going. One foot pointed away, still talking. Anthony watched them for a moment. Vanessa was gesturing with her hands the way she did when she was building toward the end of a story, both arms moving, her whole body involved in the telling. She got that from her mother. The way Lily used to explain things with every part of herself, like language alone wasn't enough to contain the idea. He called Vanessa's cell. She answered after the second ring, Bo dang dung doisian tu vian. Rasedi, a pause. Then her voice shifted register. Just slightly. But he heard it. Kochunzive, Rasechuk, Bo zaitiksao. Another pause, shorter this time, and he could hear the decision happening on her end. She was 19, not 6. She could read the particular flatness in his voice that meant this is different, even when the words themselves gave nothing away. Okay, she said. Mort J. He watched her say something quick to Kimberly, who glanced across the street toward the Civic with an expression Anthony couldn't quite read at this distance. Then Vanessa was walking toward him, backpack bouncing, headphones still around her neck, an expression caught somewhere between irritated and worried, which was the specific combination she made when she'd already decided the worry was probably valid but hadn't committed to showing it yet. She got in and pulled the door shut. Saumat bo? Nive? Thatze, Antoine di, bo, Vanessa. She put the seatbelt on. He was already pulling away from the curb, making a left, heading away from the apartment rather than toward it. Pattern break. Simple precaution. Nothing dramatic. Just the habit of a man who'd learned early that going straight home when something new had entered the picture required thinking first. Bo dang, lambo so con. Her voice was careful. Bo kom ko ido. He checked the rearview mirror, nothing obvious behind them. Chung hop hom ne sao? She stared at him. The specific exasperation of someone watching an adult do something she found genuinely bewildering, then apparently decided to play along. Te zao su fe bing bai ver kwa con ma không nhìn vào nó du lo de tuk su te but gu điều gì. Chỉ nói chung chung rồi đi sang người khác. Va con de ve kai do trong ba tuan. A pause. Anyway, bo lai di do ve? He made another left, then a right, looping back in a long arc toward a commercial strip he'd mapped out in his first month here. A shopping center with a parking lot that gave good sight lines in every direction, and 2 separate exits onto different streets. He pulled in and parked in the middle section, where he could see both entrances, and sat with the engine idling. Con ngui gui bo một bức ảnh, he said. She went very still, loi ảnh gì, con đừng ngoài tu viện, hôm nay, được chụp bởi ai đó con không biết, và họ gửi vào điện thoại bố để nói điều gì. He looked at her. She had her mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown, that looked almost black in low light, and her mother's habit of going very quiet when something frightened her still water rather than noise. Lily had been like that, the stillness that wasn't absence but containment. De cha bo biết rằng, họ biết con ở đâu. Vanessa held his gaze for a long moment. Vậy thì họ là ai? Bo chưa biết chính xác. Which was true as far as it went. He had a category. People from before. But before was a long chapter with a lot of names in it, and narrowing down to one specific name was going to take time he wasn't sure he had. Việc này có liên quan đến công việc trước đây của bố không? Có. Trước khi bố làm vệ sinh trường học. Có. She nodded slowly. She'd known in the abstract that there was a before. Kids always did. Anthony had never constructed a fictional backstory, but he'd never explained the actual one either, and Vanessa was sharp enough to notice the gaps. She noticed the way he sat in rooms. She noticed that he never got lost anywhere, even in a city he'd never visited. She noticed that when she'd knocked a glass off the counter last spring and it shattered, he'd moved faster than the situation strictly required. She'd never pushed. Maybe she'd been protecting herself from knowing, or protecting him from having to say it. 19-year-olds had an instinct for which doors they weren't quite ready to walk through. Vậy bây giờ mình làm gì? Tối nay mình không về nhà. She looked at him. Không về luôn không? Cần đảm bảo trước đã. Bố ơi, con có lớp sáng mai. Bố biết, và con không có đồ, con thậm chí không có sạc điện thoại. Mình sẽ ghé Walgreens. She exhaled through her nose, the sound he recognized as her version of suppressing something considerably larger. She looked out the windshield at the parking lot. The strip mall, the completely ordinary Wednesday afternoon happening all around them. A woman unloading groceries from a minivan. 2 older men sitting on a bench outside a hardware store, talking about nothing in particular. Okay, she said finally. Okay, nhưng con không ngu trong xe, con sẽ không ngu trong xe, và con cần ban chai dine. Wrong, mình sẽ mua. She pulled her knees up, rested her feet on the dashboard, a habit he'd given up trying to break sometime around her 17th birthday, stared straight ahead. Bố phải kể cho con nghe nhiều hơn, she said. Về trước đây, không phải tối nay nhất thiết, nhưng sớm thôi. Bố biết sẽ kể. She didn't push it, she just nodded, and he pulled out of the parking lot, and they drove. The Econo Lodge on Route 7 had a night clerk, who took cash without commentary, which was either a reflection of the establishment's general philosophy toward its guests, or the fact that it was 6:30 on a Wednesday, and the man behind the desk was watching a basketball game on his phone, with the focused intensity of someone whose entire emotional state was riding on the 4th quarter. Anthony paid for 2 nights, took the key cards, got back in the car where Vanessa was waiting, with a plastic Walgreens bag containing 2 toothbrushes, 1 travel-size toothpaste, a phone charger, a bag of chips, and a bottle of water she'd already opened and half finished. Because she'd been thirsty, and hadn't asked because she already knew. He'd say yes. Hi, dame. She looked at the key envelope. Phong knew her. The room smelled like someone had smoked in it sometime last decade, despite the non-smoking sign. Water stain on the ceiling tile above the bathroom. 2 beds. A TV bolted to the dresser. A window with a view of the parking lot that Anthony checked before Vanessa finished brushing her teeth. Good sight lines. 1 parking lot entrance. Corner room with a shared wall on only one side. Not perfect, workable. Vanessa came out of the bathroom and immediately sat down on the bed closest to the door, which was not the bed he wanted her in. He moved her phone from that nightstand to the one beside the window bed, without saying anything about it. She looked at him, looked at the phone, looked back at him. Bố muốn con ở giường cạnh cửa sổ, she said. Cái đó thoải mái hơn. Cả hai khi zombie hate nhau, Kaya so ko goi tot hun. Boy, goi la goi. But she switched beds without arguing, grabbed the remote, and started flipping through channels with the disinterested efficiency of someone who'd already accepted she wasn't going to find anything but felt obligated to check. Anthony sat on the edge of his bed and pulled out his phone, looked at the photograph again. The timestamp showed it had been taken at 2:51 in the afternoon. Vanessa's last class ended at 2:30. She'd been outside for maybe 20 minutes before the photo was taken, which meant whoever it was had been in position before she left the building. That was planning. That was someone who knew her schedule. He zoomed in on the figure by the telephone pole. Dark jacket, dark pants. Could be anywhere from 35 to 55 at this distance. Hands visible, nothing in them. No phone, no bag. Just standing with the weight, balanced the specific way you learned. When you needed to look relaxed while staying ready. Somebody trained, somebody disciplined, somebody who'd been told where to stand and had executed that instruction without improvising. Not a principal, a watcher, somebody sent. His phone rang, same number as before. Almost right, not quite. Anthony looked at it for 3 full seconds. Vanessa had stopped pretending to look at the TV. She was watching him with her legs crossed and the chip bag unopened in her lap. He answered, put the phone to his ear, said nothing. A pause on the other end, the kind of pause that was calibrated, not uncertain, just waiting to see how the other person opened. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 4 years. Trongang kwede vakelaunya Anthony. Anthony's jaw tightened, just slightly. The one involuntary thing. Raymond Harris. A sound that might have been amusement. Raymond Harris had a voice like weathered concrete, not deep exactly, but dense, like there was a lot of mass compressed behind it. Anthony had spent 2 years in the field with that voice in one ear, taking direction, trusting the intelligence it delivered. He'd stopped trusting it 4 years ago, around the time he'd started to understand why Lily died. Lozoi kong up, Harris said. Anthony said nothing. Anh không muốn nói chuyện à? Not a question. Được thôi. Tôi nói. Tôi muốn nói chuyện thật sự. Không phải kiểu anh đang tự nhủ về mình suốt 3 năm qua. Con gái tôi trong bức ảnh đó. Tôi biết. A pause that didn't sound like regret. Đó là để chứng minh khả năng. Không phải ý định. Cô bé không phải thứ tôi muốn. Vậy anh muốn gì? Source code. Kien chuk tuat tuan gok. Kai anh lady hi anh rơi chung ching. Anthony looked at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed. Someone had tried to paint over it once and given up. Chung ching de bị zai te. Moi tu de bị xóa. Moi tu ching tuk de bị xóa, Harris said. Anh đã tạo bản sao. Tôi biết anh đã làm vì anh là anh. Và anh chưa bao giờ trong cuộc đời tin tưởng ai khác giữ bản duy nhất của thứ gì quan trọng. Anh đã tạo bản sao trước khi đi vì một phần của anh biết ngày này có thể đến. Vanessa had put the chip bag down. She was watching him with the still expression that meant she was processing every half of the conversation she could hear. Harris continued. Tôi không yêu cầu anh làm gì bạo lực. Tôi chỉ cần kiến trúc nền chúng ta gặp nhau trao đổi. Và anh về với cây tàu của anh. Con gái anh về với lớp học của cô bé mọi người đi tiếp. Còn những người kia, Anthony said. A silence, brief. Harris had let that slip, or had chosen to let it slip as information. Hard to tell with Harris. Had always been hard to tell. Anh có 24 tiếng, Harris said. Sau đó tôi không còn là người giữ cho những người kia bình tĩnh nữa. The call ended. Anthony sat on the edge of the bed with the phone in his hand, and the room very quiet around him, except for the distant hum of the air conditioning unit that kicked on with a sound like an old engine turning over. Bo. Vanessa's voice was careful. Chúng ta có đang gặp nguy hiểm không? He wanted to tell her no. He had told her no in various forms for 3 years. No, everything is fine. No, that's not something to worry about. No, I have it handled. He'd built their entire life in Denton on the foundation of no. It's fine, and she was 19, not 9. And lying to her now felt like something he'd spend a long time regretting in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Có người muốn thứ gì đó từ bố, he said. Và họ đang dùng con để đảm bảo bố hợp tác. Họ muốn gì? Thứ từ công việc cũ của bố. Từ bố đã giữ lại. Bố có nó không? He looked at her. She processed this. Thì tại sao không đưa cho họ? Nếu nó giúp họ bỏ mình ra vì không đơn giản như vậy. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Thứ họ muốn là một loại công nghệ. Về bộ nhớ, về việc thay đổi những gì người ta nhớ, Nhưng gì họ tin là đã xảy ra. He stopped. Nếu người sai có kiến thức đầy đủ về cách nó vận hành, rất nhiều điều xấu trở nên có thể. Vanessa was quiet. Kiểu xấu nào? Kiểu làm ai đó tin rằng họ đã làm điều họ không làm, hoặc quên điều họ cần nhớ, hoặc xây dựng hệ thống làm điều đó theo quy mô lớn với nhiều người cùng lúc. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, looked at the muted television, an advertisement for something completely unrelated to any of this. Nghe như khoa học viễn tưởng, bổ biết, nhưng không phải vậy thật sự. Phải không? He looked at her, and sometimes she said something that made him acutely aware of how much. She'd grown up while he was busy building a wall around her and calling it protection. Không, he said. Không phải vậy. She held out the chip bag toward him. He took a few, which he didn't particularly want but which felt like the right thing to do, and they sat in the dim hotel room while the parking lot lights came on outside, and the night closed down around them. And Anthony's mind was already doing the thing he'd spent 3 years trying to stop it from doing. Running scenarios, mapping angles, calculating variables. 8 months ago, Anthony had been on his lunch break, a peanut butter sandwich and an apple, same as almost every day because it required no planning when he'd picked up the free local paper someone had left in the break room and flipped through it out of habit. Habit of performing ordinary. Habit of being the kind of man who read the paper on his lunch break. The headline had been unremarkable at first. Neurocore Technologies CEO announces partnership with Denver Medical Center for Neurological Research. Tech company partnerships with hospitals were common enough to not register as anything except background noise. He'd gotten through 2 paragraphs before the phrase stopped him. Non-invasive cognitive interface. Something at the back of his neck. He read the rest carefully. Monica Reed, 30 years old, had founded Neurocore 5 years ago out of postgraduate research at MIT. The company's flagship product, something called the Cortex Bridge, was described as a medical device designed to help patients with severe memory impairment, Alzheimer's patients, traumatic brain injury survivors, by creating what the article called a digital map of existing neural pathways that could serve as a navigational framework for a damaged brain. The medical applications were described in careful, accessible language, entirely benign, entirely credible. Anthony had put the paper down, eaten the rest of his sandwich, looked out the break room window at a stretch of parking lot baking in the afternoon heat, and thought about the phrase digital map of existing neural pathways for longer than he should have, because that was not in those exact words, not in the consumer-friendly language of medical technology, what the program had been. The program he'd signed enough clearance documents about to never say its name out loud. In its original military application, the program created a detailed structural map of a subject's memory architecture and then theoretically allowed selective modification. Theoretically, because it had never worked cleanly in practice. The margin for error was significant. The ethical review had spent 9 months debating it before the program was officially shut down on the grounds that the risk-to-benefit ratio was unacceptable under any reasonable interpretation. But the architecture still existed. In the encrypted file on the drive he kept behind the loose baseboard panel in the utility closet of his apartment, the same drive he'd told Harris he didn't have. Because having it was the one card he'd kept, and handing it over without understanding the board being played was the stupidest thing he could do in a long career that included some genuinely competitive contenders. He'd dismissed the connection. Told himself he was pattern matching in the way anxious people did. Told himself the similarity in language was coincidence. Filed it under things I noticed and chose not to act on and got back to his afternoon. But he'd installed an automated keyword filter. That same evening, something he'd had in place since Denton, but that he'd quietly updated after reading that article, to watch for anything connected to Neurocore or Monica Reed in Colorado news. 3 days before the photograph of Vanessa arrived, the filter had triggered. The alert was small. A brief item on a Denver tech news site. 4 paragraphs. Neurocore CEO Monica Reed reported missing from headquarters. Reed had been in her office at the end of the workday. The The building had gone into a routine security review, the kind that happened quarterly, locking down floors for an hour, while the system ran its checks. When the review ended and staff returned to the executive floor, her office was empty. No signs of struggle. Security footage from the corridor showed no one entering or leaving during the 40-minute window. Her car was still in the parking garage. Her phone went to voicemail. She had, as far as anyone could determine, simply ceased to be in the room. Anthony had read it twice, closed the browser, sat with it, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, not fear exactly, but the particular physical sensation of a pattern completing, like pressing a key and hearing the lock turn. Then 3 days later, the photograph. Not coincidence. Not anymore. At 9:30 in the evening, after Vanessa had fallen asleep with the TV still murmuring, she'd slept with background noise since she was small, a habit that had never changed. Anthony sat in the chair by the window, with a piece of hotel notepad paper and a pen, and tried to reconstruct a network he'd spent 3 years deliberately letting decay. Who was still active, who had gone to ground, who had moved sideways into private sector work, which was where most of them ended up when they left. Security consulting, intelligence contracting, defense-adjacent companies that were technically civilian but operated in the same brackish water they'd always operated in. He wrote 2 names. Brian Thompson, former intelligence analyst, Anthony's primary technical support across 3 operations. He'd gone to work for a cybersecurity firm in Austin after rotating out. Methodical. The kind of person who slept 4 hours a night and spent the other 20 building redundancies. If Anthony needed someone to trace the origin of a spoofed call or dig into the corporate structure of a company looking for access points, Brian was it. The problem was Brian was careful too. More careful in some ways than Anthony, and reaching out after 3 years of silence was going to require something. Lorraine Mitchell, former combat medic, later redeployed as a field operative specializing in extraction. Currently, as far as Anthony's 3-year-old information went, somewhere in northern Colorado. She and Anthony had worked together twice. Both times she'd been the reason he came back. He owed her. He wrote a 3rd name, stared at it, then crossed it out. Not because the person wasn't capable, because the last time Anthony had seen him, the context had ended in a way that left a very specific shape of damage. And trust, once it broke along certain lines, left a seam you could always find if you pressed. He wrote an address instead. Neurocore Technologies, Denver, Colorado. 43 miles from Denton. 43 miles from the life he'd spent 3 years assembling piece by careful piece. He thought about Monica Reed, 30 years old, disappeared from a locked room, had probably been sitting at her desk 5 seconds before and found herself somewhere else 20 seconds after. With no record of the transition. She hadn't chosen to be at the center of this. She'd built something, and someone had used it, and now she was in a room somewhere paying the price for someone else's decisions. Anthony understood that particular configuration. He folded the paper and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he sat back in the chair, with his back to the wall. Always the wall, always the wall. Some things you built into the body so deep they became architecture, and watched the parking lot through the gap in the curtains, and let his mind do the thing he'd spent 3 years trying to stop it from doing. Cataloging angles, distances, points of entry, the particular quality of silence that meant someone was outside, versus the quality that meant you were alone. He was not the man with the mop anymore. He wasn't entirely sure when that had stopped being true, whether it was the photograph, or the phone call, or this exact moment sitting in a budget motel chair watching his daughter sleep and understanding, with a clarity that had no warmth in it whatsoever, that hiding had never been the same thing as safe. He'd told himself for 3 years that it was. Had built every single day on that premise. Had made Vanessa's life small and portable, and deliberately rootless because he'd convinced himself that small and portable was safer than rooted and visible. Except here they were, and the only difference was that now he understood what he was actually dealing with. The AC unit clicked on. The parking lot stayed empty. Vanessa's breathing stayed slow and even, and Anthony Wilson, who had once cleared a building in 12 minutes, with nothing but a blade and a complete absence of hesitation, sat in the chair and waited for morning, the way he'd waited for morning in a lot of dark rooms over a lot of years. He started planning. He called Brian Thompson at 6:14 in the morning, standing outside the Econo Lodge in the thin early cold, with a cup of vending machine coffee that tasted like recycled cardboard and a cigarette he'd bummed off the overnight clerk even though he hadn't smoked in 2 years. Some habits recognized emergencies, even when the conscious mind was still pretending otherwise. Brian picked up on the 4th ring, which meant he'd been awake. Brian was always either fully awake or completely unreachable, with no observable middle state. The first thing he said was not hello. Tôi đã tu hỏi bao giờ anh mới gọi. Anthony pulled on the cigarette and looked at the empty parking lot. Anh biết, tôi nghe thấy chuyển động trong các kênh tôi vẫn theo dõi. Không có gì cụ thể. Chỉ là kiểu tiếng xảy ra khi ai đó đang tái cơ cấu một chiến dịch. A pause. In the background, Anthony could hear the particular ambient hum of Brian's workspace, multiple computers running, the occasional soft click of keys. Anh đang ở đâu? Econo Lodge, Route 7, Denton. Anne và Denton, stating a fact. Moi tu sẽ ra nhan Vanessa. Và Anne không? Okay. Another pause. Anne couldn't gì. This was the thing about Brian. He didn't editorialize. Didn't say I told you this would catch up with you, or 3 years, and you're calling me for help. All of which would have been frankly accurate. He just asked what you needed and started working on it. Anthony had known a lot of people in his previous life. The ones who led with what you needed instead of what they felt about the situation were rarer than they should have been. Raymond Harris, Anthony said. A silence on the line. Then, Tôi so đó là cái tên anh sẽ nói. Anh biết gì về những gì anh ta đã làm. Tôi biết anh ta rời chương trình tam tàng sau anh. Câu chuyện chính thức là nghỉ hưu. 22 năm phục vụ. Toàn bộ gói đãi ngộ. Nghe nói bài phát biểu lúc tiên biệt của anh ta rất được lòng người. Brian's voice carried the flat precision it got when he was being exact about something. Câu chuyện không chính thức phức tạp hơn. Anh ta thành lập một công ty tư vấn. Leverage Strategic Solutions kiểu tên bạn đặt khi muốn trông hợp pháp mà. Không nói cụ thể mình làm gì. Doanh thu không khớp với bất kỳ công việc khách hàng nhìn thấy được nào. Nhưng có những kết nối các lớp công ty vỏ bọc dẫn đến Neurocore. Bao lâu anh đã theo dõi điều này? Khoảng 6 tháng sau bài báo về Cortex Bridge, tôi nhận ra những gì họ đang mô tả. A pause. Tôi suýt gọi cho anh, sao anh không gọi? Brian was quiet for a moment. Vì anh đã xây dựng thứ gì đó ở Denton. Anh và Vanessa. Tôi không chắc đó có phải việc của tôi để kéo anh ra không. He said it simply. No apology, no defensiveness, just a man explaining a calculation he'd made and had apparently been revisiting ever since. Tôi nên gọi. Cô, Anthony said. Anh nên gọi. Nhưng chúng ta đang ở đây rồi, chúng ta đang ở đây rồi. The keyboard clicking picked up. On Brian's end, CEO, Monica Reed. Mất tích 3 ngày trước. Tôi thấy bài báo, không có footage không phải tự nhiên. Ai đó đã chỉnh sửa hệ thống bảo mật, công việc tinh vi, không phải hacker nghiệp dư. Xâm nhập cấp quân sự nghĩa là hoặc người của Harris đã làm hoặc ai đó ở cấp của anh ta, và sự chồng chéo giữa hai nhóm đó nhỏ. Another keyboard sound. Tôi đã cố gắng truy tìm nơi cô ấy có thể bị đưa đến. Có 3 bất động sản kết nối với mạng lưới Shell của Leverage Strategic, một ở New Mexico, một ở Wyoming, và một ở Denver khu River North. Được mua 14 tháng trước. Được liệt kê là kho cho một công ty logistics. Không có bằng chứng về bất kỳ chuyến hàng thực tế nào. Denver, Anthony said. Denver, Brian confirmed. Anthony dropped the cigarette, stepped on it, looked back at the motel room window. Through the gap in the curtain, he could see the television still on from the night before. Blue light in the dim room. Vanessa would be waking up soon. Tôi cần hai too, he said. Tôi cần mắt trên bất động sản đó trước khi tôi tiếp cận nó. Và tôi cần ai đó đưa Vanessa đến nơi Antoine trong khi tôi đi chuyến. A pause slightly longer than Brian's usual rhythm. Lorraine đang ở Fort Collins. Tôi biết cô ấy sẽ làm, nhưng anh cần tự gọi cho cô ấy. Tôi biết. He rubbed his jaw. Anh có thể tìm cho tôi layout của bất động sản River North không? Anh vệ tinh sơ đồ mặt bằng. Bất kỳ hồ sơ giấy phép nào còn tồn tại. Cho tôi 3 tiếng. Cho tôi 2 và nửa. Cho tôi 3 và tôi cũng sẽ có cho anh cấu trúc công ty đầy đủ của Neurocore từ khi thành lập. Vì tôi nghĩ những gì bên trong công ty đó sẽ quan trọng hơn tòa nhà. A pause. Anthony, Harris không hoạt động nhỏ. Bất cứ thứ gì anh ta xây dựng xung quanh việc này, nó đã mất nhiều năm. Sự kiên nhẫn, nguồn lực, người ở đúng vị trí. Đi vào mà không biết rõ là, tôi không đi vào mà không biết. Đó là lý do tôi gọi cho anh. He said it sharper than he intended. Then because Brian deserved better, tôi nghe anh. Tôi sẽ cẩn thận. Cẩn thận như anh thật sự có ý đó, Brian said. Không phải như anh hay có ý đó. Anthony didn't answer that. Because there wasn't a good answer. He hung up and stood in the cold morning air for another moment. Looked at the sky going pale at the edges. Thought about everything that had to happen before this day ended. Then he went back inside. Vanessa was awake. She was sitting on the edge of her bed with her hair still compressed on one side, from sleep when eating the last of the chips for breakfast with the philosophical acceptance of someone who knew this wasn't ideal but was too hungry to wait. She looked up when he came in. Bo kamui koi, she said. Bo team được điều thuốc, bo da bo thuốc rồi, bo biết. He sat on his bed and rubbed his face. The plan was taking shape now, or the beginning of the plan, which was all you ever really had at this stage. The shape of the first few moves. The rest you built as you went, adjusting for what the situation gave you. Bo kan kondia vayida mot vai ngai, he said. Vanessa stopped chewing, looked at him with an expression that was doing several things at once. Fear underneath, something that wanted to be anger, but hadn't decided yet. And underneath both of those, the particular quiet of someone who'd been in the passenger seat long, enough to recognize when the destination had been decided without her. I? Tên cô ấy là Lorraine. Cô ấy là người bố đã làm việc cùng từ lâu. Đáng tin. Hơn hầu hết những người bố từng biết. Cô ấy có một nơi ở Fort Collins không liên kết với bất kỳ điều gì trong chuyện này. Và bố sẽ làm gì thì mai đó? He paused. Một người phụ nữ tên Monica Reed. Cô ấy là CEO của một công ty công nghệ. Cô ấy tìm ra thứ gì đó bên trong công ty mình mà ai đó quyết định không nên biết. Và bây giờ cô ấy mất tích. Vanessa put the chip bag down. Bố sẽ tìm ra cô ấy. Bố sẽ cô. Có thể không phải bố làm một mình không? Không thể gọi ai chính thức sao cảnh sát. FBI Harris có những kết nối đi rất sâu. Nếu bố gọi sai người, bố đang gọi đúng người của anh ta. She was quiet for a moment, picked at the chip bag without taking anything out. Bố nghe kak, she said. Kak new to now? She thought about it, looked at him carefully, the way she did when she was trying to be accurate rather than kind. New ching bo, she said finally. New kill bo luan. Lama bo da zodi. He didn't know exactly what she meant by that in every particular, but it landed somewhere he couldn't armor against, and he sat with it for a moment before he said anything else. He leaned forward. The quan trọng nhất bố có thể làm cho cả hai, ngay bây giờ, là đưa con đến nơi an toàn, và sau đó di chuyển đủ nhanh, để Harris đang phản ứng với bố thay vì bố phản ứng với anh ta. Được không? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up the chip bag and held it out toward him one more time. He took a few, and they sat in the early morning light of a budget motel room, with the parking lot still empty, outside, and the day beginning to assemble itself. And Anthony thought about everything that was coming, and what it was going to cost to get through it. He called Lorraine Mitchell at 6:45. She answered immediately. Anthony Wilson, not surprised, expectant even. Lorraine, tôi cần một việc lớn. Vanessa, flat, certain ko gui vi tri cho tôi sẽ đến trong 2 tiếng, and that was the entire negotiation. No conditions, no explanation demanded, just a woman who understood that some asks didn't require context to deserve a yes. He'd been right about the debt. He'd also been wrong about it in the way you were always wrong, when you reduced a person to what they owed you. She arrived in 1 hour and 50 minutes, which meant she'd been driving before he'd even finished the call. She drove a dark green Jeep Wrangler, old enough to lack GPS tracking and new enough to be reliable in all weather. And she had the same quality she'd always had, the kind of stillness that wasn't absence but compression, like considerable energy held in a carefully maintained space. She was 42 now. Close-cropped, natural hair that had gone partly gray, the kind of beauty that had gotten more precise with time rather than softer. She and Vanessa met in the parking lot, and Anthony watched Vanessa do the thing she always did with new adults, a rapid, thorough assessment in the first 30 seconds, ending in a judgment she would mostly stick to. Whatever she found in Lorraine apparently cleared the bar. because the assessment resolved into something cautious but not hostile. Bo noi ko la người tot, Vanessa said. Bo chao ka ding kien, Lorraine said. Nhin kom sai. She glanced at Anthony. Ang chom yu ngu chen ge, toi ngu chen ge tất nhiên. She looked back at Vanessa. Chao ko do kom? Tui Walgreens Ming ses upset, said with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had improvised in considerably harder circumstances than a missing phone charger. And Vanessa, who could detect condescension from 400 feet and never let it go unremarked, apparently detected none of it. She picked up her bag. Anthony walked Vanessa to the Jeep. She threw the bag in the back seat and turned around and looked at him. And he was aware not for the first time but more sharply than usual of how tall she'd gotten. She was only a few inches shorter than him now. She'd been so small for so long. And then time had done what time did when you weren't paying close enough attention. Confront, she said. Bo se confront. Confront nu tatsu confront, she said. Không phải nu bo hai lam. And she said it, with the exact same inflection he'd heard from Bryant 20 minutes ago on the phone independently arrived at, which meant it was something real about him, that he probably needed to think about. He pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than either of them usually allowed. She didn't pull away first. Then she got in the Jeep, and Lorraine drove them away. And Anthony stood in the parking lot watching until the Jeep turned out onto Route 7 and disappeared behind the tree line. Then he got in the Civic and pointed it toward Denver, toward NeuroCore, toward Monica Reed, wherever she was, toward Raymond Harris, who was waiting somewhere with patience and resources, and the particular confidence of a man who had spent so long operating in the dark that he'd forgotten the dark wasn't permanent. He was wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. Brian Thompson did not editorialize. That was the thing Anthony kept coming back to as he drove north on I-25 toward Denver with the Civic's check engine light doing its usual impression of a thing he'd stopped seeing. 3 years of silence. 3 years of Anthony making himself small and deliberate and invisible. And Brian's first instinct, when the call finally came, was not to say anything about the 3 years. He just asked what was needed and started building toward it. Anthony had known a lot of people. Most of them led with how they felt about the situation before they led with how they could help it. But Brian was not most people, which was why Anthony had written his name first on the hotel notepad paper. Which was why he was already trusting the intel without having verified it yet. Some things you carried with you from the previous life, because they were genuinely true, and not because you were being sentimental about a time that was gone. The city came up gradually, inverted that. It didn't announce itself. It accumulated, buildings getting taller, traffic thickening. The flatland giving way to infrastructure, and then to the particular compressed energy of a city that had been growing faster than its roads could accommodate for the better part of a decade. He exited toward the River North District before Brian had technically finished building the dossier, because 3 hours was 3 hours, and he had 40 minutes of that left, and he could look at the target from the street without going in. Looking wasn't entry. Looking was reconnaissance. Looking was what you did before you did anything that couldn't be undone. The River North neighborhood was having an identity crisis. Half of it had already become what the city wanted it to be. Converted warehouses with expensive restaurants on the ground floor and art studios above them. Coffee shops, where the person behind the counter took the grind time personally. Gallery spaces with white walls and track lighting. And the quiet confidence of buildings that knew they were being photographed for Instagram. The other half had not agreed to the transition. Loading docks with chain link, the smell of diesel and rubber from the trucking companies still running out of the viaduct corridor. Buildings with honest grime on them, the kind of commercial real estate that wasn't interested in being discovered. The address Brian had sent was in the second half. Anthony drove past once without slowing. A squat 2-story concrete building set back from the street behind a parking area separated from the sidewalk by a chain-link gate that stood open. The signage said Consolidated Freight Solutions in letters that were trying very hard to look like they'd been there a long time. The paint was too uniform. Too fresh. The kind of letters you put up when you need something to look like it belongs and you're willing to spend the money, but not the time. 3 cameras he could see. 2 on the building corners, 1 above the gate. 2 dark-colored SUVs in the parking area. No foot traffic. No ground floor windows, either original to the construction or deliberately covered after the fact. He was betting on after. He drove past a second time, a different angle, slower but not suspicious slow. Just the speed of someone looking for an address. No one came out. No one adjusted their position. The cameras didn't move, but that didn't tell him anything. Fixed cameras were standard. Pan tilt was the upgrade you got when you had the budget and the personnel to watch the feeds in real time. He parked 4 blocks east on a residential side street where the Civic looked like any of the other aging sedans that populated this part of the city. Sat with his phone, waited. Brian's full report came through 11 minutes later, not 3 hours. Because Brian had been building it before, Anthony even asked, which was what you did when you were actually tracking something and not just claiming to. The building had been constructed in 1987 as a refrigerated distribution facility. The purchase 14 months ago had gone through a Delaware LLC that linked to a Nevada holding company that linked to a Wyoming trust before it. Got murky in the specific way things got murky when someone with legal resources had arranged the structure deliberately. The renovation permits were vague, interior upgrades, electrical, HVAC, the kind of language that covered almost anything if you filed the right forms and knew who to call. Brian had also found something else. The attachment came labeled Corporate Structure Full. Anthony opened it and read through it twice. 4 senior executives at NeuroCore below Monica Reed had financial connections to the leveraged strategic network. The cleanest trail, the one Brian had highlighted, ran through the CO, Victor Bryant. With the company since year 2, revenue-sharing arrangements that moved through 3 intermediate entities before touching anything connected to Harris. 30 months of it, going back before Harris had even officially left the government program. An inside man. Not recruited after the fact. Positioned early. Anthony sat with that for a long moment. Someone had looked at what Monica Reed was building when it was still small enough that a COO hire could shape the direction. Had placed Victor Bryant inside that company when it was still figuring out what it was going to be. Had spent 2.5 years steering the research without Monica ever knowing the wheel wasn't entirely hers. That was patient. That was the kind of long-form patience that most people couldn't sustain, because most people needed to see progress to stay motivated. Harris had never needed that. Harris was the kind of person who planted things and then walked away and came back when the growing was done. Anthony had always admired that about him. Had found it useful for a long time. Found it considerably less comfortable now that he was on the receiving end of it. He called Brian. Victor Bryant, he said the moment Brian picked up. COO since year 2. His personal financial profile is clean on the surface. No unusual spending, no offshore accounts in his name. But the LLC chain I mentioned in the report, Bryant, is a signatory on one of the intermediate entities, buried in a way that requires knowing specifically where to look. How long did it take you to find it? 4 hours. 6, to confirm. Which means a standard forensic audit would miss it unless they had reason to look specifically at that entity, which they wouldn't, unless they already knew, which they wouldn't, Brian confirmed. Anthony looked at the building down the street, the camera, the closed door, whatever was inside that he couldn't see yet. I need to go in before dark. The north side has a utility access point. The original building sat over part of the city's decommissioned steam infrastructure, the old district heating network from the 80s. There are underground access tunnels that run beneath several blocks in that area. The utility hatches aren't on the facility's camera perimeter because they're technically city infrastructure, and accessing them requires a different permit classification. How confident? 65%. And Anthony almost laughed, because 65% was not confidence. 65% was a coin flip with better branding, but 65% on Brian's assessment was built from satellite imagery permit records, historical infrastructure maps, and whatever else he'd been pulling for the last several hours, which made it worth considerably more than the number suggested in isolation. The building's security camera at the northeast corner has a timing gap, Brian added. The unit cycles every 90 seconds to recalibrate. During the cycle, the coverage angle shifts approximately 18 degrees. The gap lasts 4 seconds. If you're moving during those 4 seconds between the dumpsters and the north wall, you're not on camera. You timed that remotely. I've been watching the feed from a traffic camera 2 blocks east for the last 40 minutes. The angle isn't ideal, but it's enough. Anthony sat with the plan for a moment, running it, looking for the obvious failures. There were several. Going in alone without a weapon into a facility with an unknown number of personnel and no floor plan was not a plan that would score well in any after-action review. But the alternative was waiting for Harris to run out of patience, and waiting was the one thing he'd already spent 3 years doing and had now officially stopped. "I need you watching the exterior while I'm inside," he said. "If vehicles move, I need to know. The traffic camera gives me the street. I don't have eyes on the parking area. Street is enough. If the SUVs pull out heading this direction, I'll know they're looking for me outside rather than inside. And if they're looking for you inside?" Anthony didn't answer that. He got out of the car. The north alley smelled like standing water and the particular fermented quality of commercial dumpsters in high summer. He moved between the dumpsters and the building's north face and found the utility hatch where Brian had said it would be, a steel plate set into the ground with a city utility marker and a standard issue padlock. Standard issue, which was good news in the specific way that good news presented itself in situations like this one, not as relief, but as reduced friction. He'd spent time in his previous life learning considerably more about lock mechanisms than any person outside a professional locksmith needed to know. Standard issue city padlocks were built to a consistent specification across the state, which made them predictable, and predictable meant workable. He'd stopped at a hardware store on the way here, not for any specific item, just because old habits had a way of asserting themselves when the situation got serious. And his old habit was to stop at hardware stores when he didn't know exactly what he'd need. He'd bought a variety of small items and a tension bar and a length of stiff wire because those were the kinds of things that tended to prove useful. The lock opened in 4 minutes. He'd done it in 2 in better conditions. He'd take 4. He lifted the hatch, held still for a moment with the particular interior stillness that wasn't calm exactly, but was the thing that happened when everything became very precise and very quiet inside his skull. The mode where noise filtered out and what remained was geometry, distances, angles, the shape of what came next. Then he went down. The utility corridor was narrow, low ceiling. The steam pipes along the left wall were cold and dead, but still in place. Iron fixtures from a heating system that the city had decommissioned a decade ago without bothering to remove the infrastructure. The floor was uneven concrete, poured in sections that had settled differently over the years. He moved with his phone's flashlight held low, pointing just ahead of his feet. He counted the distance in his head, estimated when he was under the building's footprint based on his earlier street-level read of the structure. Found the second hatch in the ceiling of the corridor, this one newer, clearly installed during the renovation. No city marker on this one. Someone had identified the utility access as a potential vulnerability and chosen to own it rather than seal it, which meant they'd wanted a controlled connection point rather than an unknown one. Smart, but also the hatch was unlatched. Because you didn't lock your own emergency exit from the outside, he pushed up slowly, let it rise just enough to see through the gap. A sublevel, dark except for the amber pulse of indicator lights running along rows of server rack equipment, more hardware than you'd expect in a freight company. The kind of infrastructure that cost real money and required serious power. The air was cool and dry climate controlled, which meant a dedicated cooling system, which meant a generator somewhere on the property, which meant a fuel supply with finite capacity. Anthony filed that away. A generator big enough to run this much hardware had limits. Harris wasn't planning a long operation at this location. Whatever he intended to do here, he intended to do it fast. He came through the hatch and stood still in the amber glow. Listened. Footsteps above him one set, moving at a regular cadence. A patrol interval of about 90 seconds per pass, which matched what Brian had been tracking on the exterior cameras. Professional enough to have a route, not professional enough to vary it. He moved to the stairs. The ground floor was where it got complicated. Corridor ran the full length of the building, with rooms off both sides. The doors were heavy metal, retrofit jobs not original to the structure, added during the renovation with the particular purpose-built weight of doors designed to contain something rather than just divide space. He moved toward the east end, counted the doors. The fourth door on the left was different. Keypad lock instead of a keyed mechanism. And a small rectangular window set into the door at eye-level reinforced glass with wire mesh running through it. The kind of window that let you check on something without opening anything. Anthony looked through the glass. The room on the other side was set up as a functional, if minimal, space. A narrow bed, a small table, a single overhead fluorescent running at full brightness, which was either oversight or deliberate, the kind of lighting that made it hard to sleep and harder to lose track of time. And at the table, with her arms folded, with her arms postured, in the posture of someone who had made a decision that composure was the only resource remaining entirely under her control, sat a woman Anthony recognized from 3 months of reading about her. Monica Reed. She was wearing the same clothes she'd apparently had on when she was taken: blazer, slacks, professional dress not designed for spending an unspecified number of days on a narrow institutional mattress. Her hair, which in every photograph Anthony had seen had been pinned up in some variation of a sleek updo, was loose now, falling in natural waves around her shoulders. Because whoever had brought her here had removed whatever she'd used to pin it. Small act of control dressed up as incidental detail. There was a scratch on her left forearm, red at the edges. A few days old, not serious, but visible. On the table in front of her, a plate that had been recently cleared, a legal pad, a pen. She was writing. Anthony registered this with something that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. She'd been here however many days, 3, 4, the article hadn't been precise, and she was using the time to document. Names probably, details, whatever she could observe and record while sitting in a room she hadn't agreed to be in. That was not the behavior of someone who was waiting to be rescued. That was the behavior of someone who had accepted the situation as the current condition and was working inside it. He rapped twice on the glass. Not hard, just enough. She looked up from the legal pad, the composure held for exactly 1 second. Then something shifted in her expression, not relief, not panic, but the specific recalibration of someone who has been operating on a fixed set of assumptions and has just received information that requires an update. Her eyes moved across his face quickly, assessing. She stood and came to the door. Her voice was low and controlled, pitched to carry no further than necessary. Who are you? My name is Anthony. I'm not with the people who put you in this room. She studied his face through the glass with the focused efficiency of someone who made how to stand behind them. How did you get in? Utility, corridor, sublevel. There are guards on a rotation. I know, 90 seconds per pass. Something in her expression shifted a degree further, like she'd been running a silent probability calculation, and the number had just improved. The access code for this door. I don't have it. They never gave it to me from the inside. A pause. Obviously, I know. He looked at the keypad. 6 digits. Standard commercial hardware. Lockout after 2 failed attempts. Alarm trigger on the 3rd. Not something he could run brute force on without consequences. Tell me about the person who brings your meals. He uses a card. The keypad accepts both code and card. I watched him use it 3 times. Her eyes moved to the legal pad on the table behind her, and then back. He's due in approximately 45 minutes. I can't wait 45 minutes, I know. She looked at him steadily. There's something I need to tell you before you do whatever you're going to do. Tell me, while I figure out the door. No. Her voice sharpened slightly. Not loud, but definite. This is more important than the door. He stopped. She held his gaze through the glass. What they've built in this building upstairs, the second floor, it's not what I designed. I built a medical tool. What they turned it into. She stopped, worked against something, some internal resistance to the next words. It works. The memory modification. It's not theoretical anymore. They tested it on people who didn't agree to it, and the source code they need to complete, the weaponized version, they told me about it, because they wanted me to help them integrate it. Anthony went still. They told you what the source code is. They described the functional architecture. Yes, and you understand what it would do combined with what you built. I built the hardware and the neural mapping interface. What they're describing sounds like the behavioral modification layer. The part that doesn't just read the memory structure, it rewrites it. Her eyes on his were very clear, dark brown. The particular shade that absorbs light rather than reflecting it. If they get it, it stops being about individual targets. It becomes a system. I know what it becomes, Anthony said. She looked at him differently then. Then you know about the source code. I know about it, because I'm the one who has it. The corridor stayed quiet. The ventilation hummed, and something in her face completed a calculation that changed the shape of everything. They're using you, she said. Not an accusation. A piece of information placed between them. They're trying to. There's a difference. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door, picked up the legal pad from the table, and came back to the window. She held it up. Everything I've been able to document since they brought me here. Names, conversations, technical details about what I've observed. She held it flat against the glass so he could see the density of the writing. Page after page. Small, controlled handwriting. If you can get this out, even if you can't get me out. I'm getting you out, he said. You don't know that yet. No, he said. But I'm going to try, and I need you to move fast when the door opens and not ask questions until we're clear. Can you do that? She assessed him one more time. The same rapid, thorough read she'd given him through the glass from the beginning. Whatever she found there apparently functioned as a yes. He stepped back from the door and looked at the emergency panel mounted on the wall 30 feet down the corridor. Fire suppression interface required in every commercial building of this age and classification by Colorado code. Manual activation lever behind a break glass cover. This building had been registered as a standard commercial facility. Anthony knew this from Brian's report. No special federal security classification, because getting that classification required disclosure, and Harris had needed the whole operation to look like a freight company from the outside, which meant the fire suppression system was installed. 2. Standard commercial specifications, which meant the override protocol was standard commercial, which meant every electronic lock in the building would disengage during an emergency activation. Because that was the law. Because the people who wrote the fire safety code had not been imagining a situation where someone was using a standard commercial facility as an illegal detention site. They'd been imagining a burning building and trapped people, and they'd written a law accordingly. And Harris, for all his patience and resources and long-game thinking, had moved too fast on this particular facility to file the federal security exemptions that would have changed that calculation. Anthony walked to the panel, broke the glass with his elbow, pulled the lever. The alarm was immediate and loud, and the overhead lighting switched to emergency. Red and the fire suppression system engaged in the corridor with a sustained hiss. And from somewhere above him he heard footsteps moving fast, and voices calling to each other. And the lock on Monica Reed's door clicked. She was already moving when he pulled it open. She came through at a near run, grabbed his arm once to orient herself in the red-lit corridor, and he turned her toward the fire door at the end of the hall, and they went. Behind them, the sound of a door hitting the wall at the far end of the corridor. Someone clearing the space fast. Anthony heard the guard's footsteps behind them, and the gap between those footsteps and the fire door was close enough to require a decision. And the decision he made was to push through the fire door at full speed and let it close on its own hydraulics, which it did, with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. Into the sublevel, server racks glowing amber in the dark. Monica behind him, breathing hard but not speaking. He found the utility hatch in the floor, pulled it up and down. She went without hesitation. He went after her, pulled the hatch closed above him. They moved through the utility corridor in the dark, with his phone light, cutting just enough ahead to navigate. He counted the distance. His shoulder where he'd hit the door frame on the way through was going to register its objection tomorrow. For now it was just information. Light coming through the city access hatch above. He pushed it up, and they came out into the alley between the dumpsters. Late afternoon. The light low and orange. The alley smelled like what alleys smelled like. Monica Reed stood on the pavement in her blazer and her wrinkled slacks with the legal pad clutched against her chest and looked at the open sky above the alley walls for a moment. Just a moment. Like she was confirming it was real. Then she looked at him. Your car. 4 blocks. Can you run? She didn't wait for him to answer. She was already running. They made the Civic in 3 minutes and 40 seconds, and he drove 2 full miles before either of them said anything at all. Monica sat in the passenger seat with the legal pad in her lap and both hands flat on top of it. Her breathing was controlled in the deliberate way of someone bringing a heart rate back under discipline through sheer intention. Where are we going? She said. Somewhere I can make calls. She looked at the check engine light, then at the dent in the rear bumper visible in the side mirror, then back at the road ahead. This is your car. It is. The check engine light has been on for a while. It's 2 years approximately. And you haven't fixed it. Don't like leaving receipts. A pause. Then something happened in her expression that might have been the first moment of genuine humor she'd experienced in several days. It didn't quite make it to a smile, but it was adjacent to one. Tell me about Victor Bryant, Anthony said. She went still. You know about Victor. His financial profile overlaps with Harris's shell network. Going back 30 months. Brian confirmed it this afternoon. She was quiet for several seconds. Looking at the road ahead, I hired him in year 2. He was genuinely brilliant at systems thinking, not the kind of brilliant that's really just confidence, the kind that actually sees structure other people miss. I thought. She stopped, started again. I thought he understood what I was building and cared about it the way I did. He understood it. He understood it, and cared about something else instead. Her voice was flat, not brittle, just stripped of anything decorative. Yes. Anthony's phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He glanced at it. Brian, he answered. They're moving. Brian's voice was immediate. 2 vehicles left the River North facility 3 minutes ago. One is circling the neighborhood, probably searching. The other went northwest, not toward Denton, toward a private airfield in Adams County. Anthony looked at Monica. She was watching him, reading the half she could hear. Harris is at the airfield, Brian continued. The cell signal I've been tracking 70% confidence it's his phone activated there 40 minutes ago. He's not running, Anthony said. No, something changed when you went into that building. He knows you have Reed now. He's consolidating. A pause. The kind Brian used when what came next was worse than what came before. Anthony. He's going to use Vanessa. The words hit somewhere behind the sternum with a force that was not metaphorical. He kept his right hand steady on the wheel, kept his voice level. Lorraine's with her. I know. But Harris has resources we don't have a complete picture of yet. If he decides to move on Lorraine's location, a pause. I'm trying to reach Lorraine now. She's not picking up. The car got very quiet. Monica had turned to look at him fully now. She'd heard enough from his side to understand the shape of it. Keep trying, Anthony said, and I need a clean network connection, a place Monica can access NeuroCore's servers remotely. There's a motel in Longmont off 119, East Side. I can have a clean laptop waiting at the front desk in 90 minutes. Room booked under a name that doesn't connect to anything. Make it 60. 75, and I'll also have the complete financial trail on the Bryant-Harris connection going back to incorporation, because I think the corporate story matters as much as the building. Anthony drove. The city was doing its late afternoon thing all around them. Traffic. People on sidewalks. A food truck with a line. The ordinary world running its ordinary program, entirely unaware that anything else was happening. Monica said, "Your daughter, yes. A beat. I'm sorry. This is because of Harris," Anthony said. "And because of choices I made a long time ago. Not because of you. She absorbed this." "That's not entirely accurate." "It's accurate enough." She looked at the road. "Then, the servers. NeuroCore's internal R&D servers. I have access points built into the architecture that Bryant doesn't know exist. I wrote that code myself. At home. Offline. Before anyone else on the team had ever seen the underlying structure. It's how I built exits into the system before the system had any users. You always build exits. My father lost 3 businesses to partners who didn't share his values and had more leverage. I decided when I was 17 that I would never be in a position where I had no way out of something I'd built." A pause. "The irony of that is not something I've missed. You built a way out. The exit worked. The exit worked because you walked into a building you had no business walking into." She looked at him. "Why?" Anthony thought about Vanessa, about the specific weight of watching someone you love go about their ordinary life, completely unaware that the ordinary was always conditional, about the legal pad Monica had been filling page by page in a room she didn't choose, about 3 years of making himself small and discovering that small wasn't the same as safe. "Because hiding is something you do until you can't anymore," he said, "and I got to the point where I couldn't." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in approximately 4 days. His phone buzzed again. He answered. Brian's voice, and this time there was something different in it. Something that was not relief but was adjacent to it. I reached Lorraine. Anthony's hand tightened on the wheel. She moved locations an hour ago. She had a protocol. She doesn't carry her phone until she's clear of the first site. That's why she wasn't picking up. She's fine. Vanessa's fine. They're in motion. The weight did not leave. It redistributed. Shifted from acute to the lower frequency of a man who knew the situation wasn't resolved. Only paused. Tell Lorraine to keep moving. 2-hour maximum at any location, already told her. Anthony exhaled once. Short. Controlled. Then he turned his focus back to the road, and the plan taking shape in the 75 minutes until the laptop was ready. Monica had turned back to the window. She was looking at the highway and the flat land and the sky going orange at the edges. Anthony watched her in his peripheral vision. The set of her shoulders, the legal pad still in her lap, the scratch on her forearm. The way she'd run out of that alley without a second's hesitation. He'd worked with people who went to pieces under pressure. He'd worked with people who held themselves together through training and the suppression of anything too human. What he was looking at now was neither of those things. It was someone who was feeling all of it and functioning through it anyway, which was harder than both other options combined. There's something you should know, he said. She turned from the window. Harris called me last night. Before I knew where you were, he said he just wanted the source code, and then he'd leave us alone. Anthony kept his eyes on the road. He was lying about the leaving us alone part. What makes you certain? A man who photographs my daughter outside her university to demonstrate capability is not a man who intends to leave loose ends. The exchange he's proposing has one version, and in that version, none of us walk away from it. She took this in with the deliberate speed she seemed to bring to every piece of information, processing before responding, not because she was slow, but because she was precise. So what is the plan? The motel outside Longmont came into view from the highway. Exit ramp ahead. We stop reacting to what Harris expects us to do, Anthony said, and we start building something he doesn't know we're building. She looked at him. What does that look like specifically? You get into the NeuroCore servers. You corrupt the weaponized development track from the inside. And then we go to whatever meeting Harris sets up, and we use what we've built. He took the exit ramp. Not blind, not on his terms, on ours. She was quiet for a moment. Then, with the gravity of someone making a commitment they intend to keep, I can corrupt the integration layer. I can do it in a way that isn't immediately obvious. It'll look intact under visual inspection. But when they run the actual behavioral modification protocol, It'll fail at the third execution stage, and the failure will cascade backward. He won't be able to tell it's been done. Not without running the full protocol test, which requires the source code to run. And there was something in her voice now that hadn't been there before. Not quite satisfaction. More like the particular energy of someone who can see exactly how a thing fits together. He'd have to use the one thing he doesn't have, in order to discover that the thing he does have is broken. Anthony pulled into the motel parking lot. But the backups, she said. There are partial copies distributed across 3 separate servers. I can corrupt the primary from remote access. But the partials will still exist unless someone physically accesses the hardware. Where's the hardware? She looked at him, and he could see the answer, arriving in her expression before she said it. If he's consolidating, if he's moving the operation to a single location for the exchange, he'll bring the hardware to wherever he wants us to come, Anthony said. Which means, we have to be there physically. We were always going to have to be there physically. Now we have a reason beyond the obvious one. She looked at him for a long moment, the particular look of someone recalibrating around a constraint they'd just decided to accept rather than argue against. Where? His phone rang before he could answer. Different number this time. Longer string of digits. Same quality of almost right, but not quite. Harris. Anthony answered on the second ring. Said nothing. I know you have, Reed. Harris's voice was the same patient density it had always been. No anger, no alarm, just the voice of a man who had updated his model and was proceeding accordingly. You've accelerated a timeline that didn't need to be accelerated. You photographed my daughter. I demonstrated capability. There's a distinction. A pause. I had a clean exchange in mind, Anthony. You've made it messier. But it doesn't have to be complicated. You had an ending in mind. That's different from clean. A short silence. I want to meet Meridian Labs outside Boulder, decommissioned facility. You know the site. Anthony did know it, had run an operation out of it in 2019. Harris knew that, had chosen it for exactly that reason. Familiarity as leverage. A way of saying, I know your geography. I know your history. I know the shape of the world you operated in before you decided to stop. Tomorrow night, Harris continued. 8 o'clock. Come alone. Reed can come. No Thompson. No Mitchell. No federal contacts. A pause. I'll know. You'll know, Anthony repeated. I have resources you're not fully aware of. Which is not a threat, it's accurate. The voice was reasonable. Unhurried. 8 o'clock. Bring the drive. Not a partial. The complete framework. The call ended. Anthony sat in the Longmont Motel parking lot for a moment. Monica was watching him. She'd heard enough. Meridian, he said. And you're thinking about going. I'm thinking about what we do instead of what he expects when we get there. He got out of the car, picked up the laptop from the motel front desk. A woman barely looked up from her phone when he gave the name Brian had booked under. Room key. Down the hall. The room was clean in the specific way. Budget rooms were clean, not comfortable, but not unpleasant either. Monica sat at the desk and opened the laptop without ceremony. 30 minutes. He called Brian from the edge of the bed. Before he could say anything, Brian said, She's in. I can see the tunnel traffic. She's good. A pause. How is she? Functional. Better than she should be given the circumstances. What about you? Same answer. He rubbed the back of his neck. The shoulder was making itself known now. Tomorrow that was going to be an unpleasant conversation. I need you to find me a federal contact. The right one. Harris has a connection at the Hill, a Senate intelligence staffer named Jeffrey Lewis. Which means standard federal channels are potentially compromised. I've been looking at that thread for the last hour. Keys clicking. There's an FBI field supervisor in Denver. Denise Walker, Organized Crime Division. Her record shows a pattern of operating with minimal internal communication when she's building a case. She's apparently burned sources before by sharing too early with the wrong people inside her own agency, and she adjusted accordingly. A pause. She's also been quietly looking at Monica Reed's disappearance without being officially assigned to it. Get to her tonight, Anthony said. Not tomorrow. Tonight. Give her the corporate structure analysis and the Lewis connection. Enough to make her want to come to wherever Harris sets the meeting. But tell her not before 9:15. Why 9:15? Because if she arrives during the exchange, Harris has leverage. If she arrives after, he has what he needs and no reason to cooperate with anyone. Anthony looked at Monica, who was working with the intense focus of someone who had compressed everything else to background noise. She arrives at 9:15, and we make sure there's enough on record before that point to make any arrest clean, regardless of what's happened inside the building. A silence on Brian's end, longer than his usual rhythm. Anthony, the part you're not saying. Anthony looked at the window. Outside, Longmont was going about its evening, ordinary and unhurried. Harris always holds something back, he said. Something he doesn't reveal until the moment he needs it. Some piece of leverage that isn't the obvious piece. He paused. I don't know what it is yet. But you think there is one. With Harris, there's always one. He thought about the man he'd known for 2 years in the field. The man who planned 3 moves deep in every situation, who had once burned a 6-month operation. Because he'd sensed something wrong about a meeting before anything actually went wrong. That man had not gotten less careful with age. We plan around the fact that there's something we don't know. And we stay flexible enough to adjust when it appears. That's not a plan, Brian said. That's a disposition. It has to be both. Monica spoke from the desk without turning around. I want to say something. Both of you. Anthony waited. I know what I built, she said. Her voice was even. Not asking for anything. I know that the technology at the center of this is mine, my research, my architecture, my 8 years of work. And I know that someone used that to build something I would never have agreed to. And I know that distinction may not matter from the outside looking in. She paused, kept working. But it matters to me. What I'm doing right now, the corruption, the documentation, putting myself in that building tomorrow, that's not me trying to fix a mistake. It's me doing what I should have done 3 weeks ago. When I found the first anomaly in the company financials. Instead of trying to handle it quietly, instead of believing I could contain it internally. Another pause. I should have called someone. I was wrong about that. The line was quiet for a moment. Anthony said, You're here now. Not absolution, not comfort, just the plain fact of where she was and what she was doing with it. I'm here now, she said, and kept working. Brian stayed on the line. The 3 of them stayed, in their separate spaces, Brian in Austin with his monitors and his tireless attention, Monica at the desk in Longmont, building her way back into a system that had been built on her own foundation. Anthony sitting on the edge of a motel bed in the gathering dark, and the plan took shape around the edges of what they didn't know yet. Outside, the evening came down, the Rockies somewhere to the west. Invisible in the dark but completely there. Tomorrow the exchange. Tomorrow Meridian. Tomorrow Harris with his patience and his resources and his certainty that he was the correction the world needed. He was wrong about that. He just didn't know it yet. And Anthony Wilson, who had spent 3 years pretending to be the least dangerous person in any room, sat in the dark and thought about everything that was coming. And thought, let it come. Meridian Labs sat in a valley east of Boulder that had been chosen originally for its isolation, close enough to the city to function, far enough out that what happened inside it stayed inside it. Anthony had been here once, in 2019, for an operation that lived in 3 separate classification compartments and would never appear in any document he could legally acknowledge. The building itself was exactly as he remembered it. Low concrete structure pressed into the hillside so deliberately that you could drive past the access road twice before the gate registered. The gate was open now. Someone had cut the lock. He stopped the Civic a quarter mile out and killed the headlights. The engine idled. The valley was very dark, in the specific way that places far from city light were dark. Not absence of light but presence of dark, which was its own distinct condition. Monica sat in the passenger seat. The legal pad was in her blazer pocket. The drive was in her inside jacket pocket, next to her phone. The transmitter, a device the size of a deck of cards that Brian had couriered to the motel that afternoon, battery-powered, range of 2 miles, toggle switch on the side, was in her left breast pocket. She'd been running it since they left the motel. Everything captured, everything streaming. Brian on the other end in Austin, watching the data move. How many? Monica said. Not a question exactly. More like thinking out loud through the shape of him. Harris ran lean in the field. 4 to 6 was his preference. Enough coverage without the logistics problems that came with larger numbers. Anthony scanned the building. No exterior lights running, they were using the darkness deliberately. But through the front-facing wall, he could see the faint bleed of interior illumination. Work lights. The generator was running. This isn't a field operation. This is something he spent years working toward. He'll have staffed accordingly. Meaning, 12, maybe more. She absorbed this. You can't fight 12 people. I don't need to fight 12 people. I need to keep 12 people occupied long enough for you to reach the hardware and for Walker to arrive. He looked at the building one more time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took out the drive. Held it for a moment. The weight of it. The 3 years of carrying it without moving. Take it. She looked at the drive in his palm. If something happens to me and you need it to negotiate, you have it. If nothing happens and we reach the server room, you plug it in under the conditions we discussed. She looked at him. Really looked. The kind of looking that was more like listening. That's not trust in the technology. No, he said, it's trust in you. She took the drive without speaking, held it for a moment, slipped it into the inside pocket next to the phone and the transmitter. 3 items that between them contained the architecture of something that could either heal people or hollow them out depending entirely on who was holding the controls. He toggled the transmitter on. The small LED went green. Walker knows 9:15, Monica said. 9:15, and if Harris moves faster than that, then we slow him down. She nodded once. The same single nod she used when something had been acknowledged and didn't require elaboration. He'd noticed it in the car the night before, and noticed it again now, and thought it was the most efficient form of agreement he'd encountered in a long time. They drove the last quarter mile in. Meridian's main entrance was a set of reinforced double doors that had been rekeyed, new lock hardware, the original government issue mechanism replaced with a commercial-grade unit that currently stood, propped open with a chunk of broken concrete. Deliberate. Someone wanted them to walk in without friction at the threshold, which was how you funneled people to exactly where you wanted them. Anthony pushed through anyway. The main level was lit with portable work lights, on stands, the kind you brought to a job site, throwing white-yellow pools across the concrete floor and leaving the corners in, shadow deep enough to be useful. The research bays had been cleared of whatever remnant equipment remained from the facility's last operational period and replaced with the infrastructure of Harris's operation. A long folding table with communications gear, 2 open laptops, a man Anthony didn't know, sitting at the table and not pretending to work, watching them come in with the professional blankness of someone who had been told what to do and was doing it. Against the far wall, 4 men in tactical configuration who were making no effort to look casual about it. 2 more positioned near the stairwell that descended to the sublevel. 6 visible, and at the center of it, standing with his hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, in the specific way Anthony recognized as Harris's version of projected calm, Raymond Harris, 60 years old, solidly built. The field gray that Anthony remembered from years ago had gone fully white, and he'd cut it shorter close to the skull now, which made him look both older and harder simultaneously. His face carried the particular quality of a man who had made difficult decisions across 2 decades and had long since stopped losing sleep over them. Not because the decisions hadn't cost anything, because he'd decided the cost was worth it, and then the deciding had calcified into certainty, and then the certainty had become the only frame he knew how to use. He looked at Anthony first, then at Monica. The assessment was brief and complete. Neither surprise nor satisfaction, just the careful neutral of a man updating his operational picture. Anthony. His voice was the same dense, unhurried stone it had always been. Harris, Ms. Reed. He nodded toward Monica. You look considerably better than I expected given the accommodations. Monica's voice came out perfectly level. I've had worse. Harris walked toward them slowly, the pace of a man who believed that the tempo of events was his to set. "Did you bring it? Did you think I wouldn't? I thought you might try something creative." He stopped about 8 feet out. The fire suppression activation was creative. Loud, but creative. 65% odds, Anthony said. Something that might have been a smile moved across Harris's face and disappeared. "Thompson's number or yours?" "His. I always liked Thompson. Methodical man." He glanced past Anthony toward the door, then back. "I assume he's somewhere with visibility on this." "I assume you assume that." A slight inclination of the head, acknowledging the dynamic without conceding anything within it. Then Harris looked at Monica directly. "You can access the development environment on the sublevel. Primary and secondary systems." He looked back at Anthony. "You have the source code framework. We run the integration here tonight with both of you present. Once it's confirmed functional, we have a conversation about next steps that doesn't require anyone to become a problem." "You said clean exchange," Anthony said. "I said a conversation about next steps. The exchange is the integration. After that, we discuss the shape of everyone's future." The voice was careful, measured. "I'm not a butcher, Anthony. I never was. I need the two of you to stop being problems, not to stop existing. Those are different requirements." Monica said. "They require the same thing. Our silence." "Your discretion," Harris said. "Willingly given or otherwise." A pause. "The distinction matters more than you might think." The word otherwise landed in the room with its full weight. Anthony kept his face level. Beside him, Monica was still. The transmitter in her pocket had been running since. Before they walked through the door. Brian was receiving. Walker was somewhere in the dark outside this building, moving toward 915. Everything was in motion. "Show me the hardware," Anthony said. Harris looked at him. "Before I give you anything, I want to see what you've built. If your implementation has architectural errors, the integration corrupts both systems and we've wasted each other's time." He held Harris's gaze. "You know I know enough about the underlying system to evaluate what you have." "Let me look." The calculation played out across Harris's face in the specific way it always had, the private arithmetic of a man deciding whether a request was reasonable enough to grant or suspicious enough to deny. And the thing Anthony was counting on was that Harris had spent years building this and would want to show it. Not from vanity exactly. From the conviction that once Anthony saw the scope of what had been constructed, the calculation about cooperation would change. "Sublevel," Harris said to the two men by the stairwell. "Take them down." The sublevel was colder than the main floor. The portable HVAC system running off the generator pushed recycled air that smelled like warm circuits and the sharp metallic edge of systems under load. The hardware was more substantial than Anthony had prepared himself to see. Server racks along the east wall, 8 units, connected to a central terminal with a medical-grade interface that Anthony recognized from the photographs Monica had filed in Neurocore's public patent. Records the physical housing of the Cortex bridge technology, stripped of its consumer casing and mounted directly into a custom rack assembly. The fabrication work was sophisticated. Whoever had done it understood both the hardware and the purpose it was being redirected toward. Monica stood still when she saw it. He watched her face in his peripheral vision. The expression that moved through it was not grief precisely, closer to recognition, the specific feeling of encountering something familiar that has been altered in ways that make the familiarity itself disorienting. She'd built the core of what he was looking at. Every rack, every connection, every carefully routed cable was downstream of choices she'd made in a research lab, working alone, believing she was building something that would help people find their way back to themselves. "Impressive," she said quietly. It was a technical assessment, not a compliment. "Years of work," one of the escorts said, apparently unable to help himself. Neither Anthony nor Monica responded to that. Anthony began moving along the rack assembly slowly, reading the cable management, the interface points between Monica's hardware and the server array. Not because he could evaluate the implementation at an engineering level, he didn't have that background. Because the movement gave him the room layout. One exit, The stairwell behind them. 4 server racks on the east wall. The central terminal. A secondary workstation to the left of the main interface, with its own keyboard and monitor. A communications panel on the north wall, running a status display that read, "System ready. Integration pending." He stopped at the secondary workstation, looked at Monica. She looked at the secondary workstation. 1 second, the length of a breath, and between them in that second passed a complete understanding that required no words. Because words would have been slower than the understanding itself. Anthony turned to the escort on his left. "I need to see the handshake log on the main interface before I give you anything. If there's an architectural mismatch between the framework and the receiving system, the integration corrupts both sides. I need 30 seconds on the main terminal." The escort looked at his counterpart with the expression of someone who hadn't been briefed on whether this was permitted, which meant he was going to check, which meant his attention was going to move from the room to the radio on his belt for the several seconds that checking required. The escort reached for his radio. Anthony stepped fully into the man's line of sight body between escort and the secondary workstation, close enough that breaking eye contact to look past him required actual physical effort. Monica walked to the secondary workstation and sat down. She didn't run, didn't rush, just walked there the way you walked to a desk you belonged at, and sat down and put her hands on the keyboard. The escort's radio clicked. Harris's voice, flat and immediate. "What's happening?" "The man wants access to the main interface." A pause. "Why is Reed at the secondary workstation?" Not a question, a recognition. The escort turned. Anthony put his shoulder into the man's sternum before the turn was complete. Not elegant, not surgical, just the application of forward momentum before the other person was positioned to absorb it. They went into the server rack together. Something in the rack clattered, and a status light went dark. Anthony's shoulder registered the collision with the particular precise language of an injury, announcing its intention to become a problem. The second escort had Anthony's collar before he'd gotten completely off the floor. And from directly above them, through the concrete ceiling, through the mass of the building, a sound that Anthony's nervous system recognized before his conscious mind processed it. The specific acoustic signature of a door coming open under force. And underneath it, the controlled, authoritative vocabulary of federal personnel executing entry. Projected volume. Deliberate. The way you used sound as a tool to manage a space, before you managed the people in it. Walker. 25 minutes early, which was wrong. The plan had been 9:15. It was 8:50. The second escort made a different calculation than Anthony expected. Instead of pressing the physical engagement, he went for the stairwell. Up, to report, to get reinforcement. Anthony let him go, because stopping him meant leaving Monica exposed, and Monica was the whole point. The first escort was still sitting against the server rack, not unconscious, just reorienting. Anthony stood up, breathing harder than he wanted to. Shoulder was definitely going to require a reckoning tomorrow. He looked at Monica. How long? Her hands were moving across the keyboard with a speed and precision that looked almost mechanical, except her face. Her face was doing something completely human, the expression of someone who knows exactly how much time they have and is refusing to surrender a second of it. 2 minutes. You have 90 seconds. Then I'd suggest you stop talking to me. He stopped talking to her. Positioned himself at the bottom of the stairwell. Listened to the building above. The federal voices had multiplied and spread across the main floor, controlled, methodical. The sound of a search pattern being executed by people who had done it enough times that the adrenaline had become procedure. And then one set of footsteps on the stairs. Measured, not hurrying. The specific cadence of a man who had decided that the pace of his movement in this moment would be the final statement he made about who he was. Harris came down the stairs alone. He reached the bottom, saw Anthony standing there. Saw Monica at the secondary workstation, not looking up, hands still moving. He stopped. They looked at each other. The room was quiet except for the ventilation and the server hum and the sound of federal activity filtering down from above. And Monica's fingers on the keyboard moving with the focused velocity of someone dismantling a thing that should never have been built. Is she in the system? Harris said. Yes. What did she do? Corrupted the integration layer. Primary and secondary, if she had enough time. Harris looked at Monica. At the secondary workstation. At her hands still moving. Ms. Reed. His voice carried the same patient density it always had. No fracture in it. Nothing that indicated the floor had shifted under everything he'd spent years constructing. If you've done what I think you've done, you've destroyed considerable work. Monica took her hands off the keyboard. She turned around in the chair, slowly, the kind of slow that wasn't uncertainty but deliberateness, and on the secondary monitor behind her, a cascade of error codes was scrolling at a speed that made reading individual lines impossible, but whose collective meaning was entirely legible to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Yes, she said. Her face was calm, the particular calm of someone who has finished a thing and is standing cleanly on the other side of it. That was the goal. Harris looked at her for a moment, then at Anthony, and something moved across his face that Anthony had not seen there in 22 years of knowing him. Not anger, not desperation. The expression of a man revising a fundamental model he had relied on for long enough that the model had become invisible to him. The thing you stopped questioning because you'd forgotten it was a choice. The drive, Harris said. Without the source code running, she can't have corrupted the integration in a way that actually functions. She'd need it active to target the right execution pathways. Anthony said nothing. Give me the drive. The voice was still reasonable, still measured, and I walk upstairs and address whatever Walker brought with her in a way that doesn't implicate you or Reed. You go home. Your daughter goes back to her university. The drive gets used in a way that I'll acknowledge looks problematic from the outside, but prevents a category of harm you can't see from where you're standing. He paused. 22 years, Anthony. You know me. I'm not the villain in this. Anthony looked at him for a long moment. I know you believe that, he said. That's the part that scares me. The sentence landed in the space between them and sat there. Harris looked at Monica, at the scrolling error codes, at the stairwell, where the sounds of a federal operation taking hold were getting closer and more organized. He looked back at Anthony with something in his face that Anthony had never seen there. Not defeat, not even resignation, just tiredness, the specific exhaustion of a man who had been carrying a certainty for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. And now the certainty was gone. And what remained was the weight of all the years he'd spent holding it. He put his hands up. Not because anyone told him to. Not because Walker's people were on the stairs yet. He put his hands up because the arithmetic had finally resolved on the wrong side of the ledger, and he was a man who read numbers accurately. Even when the numbers were bad, even when the numbers were the sum of everything he'd built and lost in the same hour. He walked to the stairwell with his hands raised and his back straight, and the particular dignity of a man who had been many things and was choosing, in this last operational moment, to be someone who did not run. Anthony stepped to the side. Harris walked up the stairs. Behind Anthony, Monica said, "It's done." He turned around. She was standing up from the secondary workstation, phone in one hand, drive in the other. The monitor behind her still scrolling error codes, faster now, the cascade reaching deeper into the system architecture. She held the drive out to him. He took it, looked at it, put it in his jacket pocket. The transmitter, she said, running the whole time. She held up her phone. Brian has it. Above them, the facility was filling with the controlled noise of a federal operation reaching its conclusion. Orders given and confirmed. The mechanical sounds of equipment being secured. Harris's voice, somewhere up there, calm, already pivoting from operational mode to something else, the mode you moved into when the field was over, and the next arena was institutional, and you needed to survive it differently. Anthony looked at the sub-level around them. The servers, the hardware, Monica's technology in a casing it had never agreed to wear. The escort still sitting against the server rack, holding his nose with both hands, and looking at the floor with the expression of a man reconsidering a series of career decisions. He looked at Monica. She looked back at him. Blazer on. Natural hair falling loose around her shoulders. The scratch on her forearm that nobody had treated yet. The phone and the drive. And the expression of someone who has been through something and is now standing on the other side of it, and is in the process of determining what that means about everything that comes next. "We should go upstairs," Anthony said. "Yes," she said, and they went. The main level looked like a room that a strong wind had moved through deliberately. Harris's communications gear pushed to one wall, one of the laptops on the floor with its screen still running. 3 of his personnel, zip-tied along the east wall, with a particular expression of men who had made a professional calculation that had turned out to be catastrophically wrong. And in the middle of it, Denise Walker. She was shorter than Anthony had constructed from Brian's description. 5'4" maybe, natural hair close to the silver at the edges. The bearing of someone who had learned to occupy exactly as much space as the situation required, and not a square foot more. She was looking at Harris when Anthony and Monica came up the stairs, and the way she was looking at him was the way someone looked at a problem they had been working on for a long time, and had finally, at real cost, solved. She turned when she heard them on the stairs. Wilson, flat, certain, not a greeting, an identification. Agent Walker. She looked at him with the careful neutral of a federal law enforcement officer who had approximately 40 questions and was deciding which one to open with. Then she looked at Monica. "Ms. Reed, are you injured?" "Scratch on my arm. Nothing serious. We'll have the medic look at it." Back to Anthony. "Brian told me 9:15. I was here at 8:50. I noticed. I moved early because the satellite traffic Brian was monitoring spiked. At 8:40. Someone inside this facility sent a message to an external contact. I didn't know what it said. I wasn't willing to find out after the fact." A pause. The explanation delivered as information, not justification. "What happened on the sublevel?" Anthony told her. Monica filled in the technical components. Walker listened, without interrupting, which was a skill considerably more people believed they had than actually possessed. When they'd finished, Anthony reached into his jacket pocket and took out the drive. Walker looked at it. She did not reach for it immediately. "That's classified material," she said. "It is. You've been in possession of classified material for 3 years." "I have." Something shifted in her expression. Not dramatic. A recalibration around a new piece of the picture. "I'm going to need a complete accounting of that." "I know. I'm prepared to give one." He held the drive out. "But I need this to go somewhere it can't be buried. Not into an evidence locker that Jeffrey Lewis can access through the right channels. Somewhere it goes into Federal Archive under multi-agency seal." She looked at him, steadily. "You know about Lewis." Brian found it. 6 hours. A short silence. "I've been trying to find that connection for 4 months. The tone was not quite wounded, more like the professional acknowledgement of a gap that had just been explained. Multi-agency seal is not a standard evidence disposition. It requires a specific classification of material and a specific threat assessment to justify the handling protocol. "I know. I can make the argument," she said. "It will take a few days. It will require conversations above my pay grade." She looked at the drive. "In the interim, this goes in my personal custody. Not the locker. That's what I was going to ask for." She took the drive, held it in her palm for a moment, looked at Harris across the room. He was standing with his wrists bound in front of him and his face composed, and he was watching the exchange between Anthony and Walker with the attentive quality of a man who was already building the next thing, already cataloging what had been said, already identifying the structural gaps in what had just happened that he might be able to use later. He was going to be a problem in a courtroom. Anthony knew that. Walker almost certainly knew that, and Harris knew they both knew it. None of which changed what this moment was. "You knew about Lewis," Harris said. He was addressing Anthony. "Not Walker. You knew and you went to Walker anyway." "Because Walker doesn't talk to the wrong people," Anthony said. Harris looked at Walker then. A long assessing look, and something in it that might have been, under different circumstances, a form of respect. Smart, he said, to neither of them in particular. Smarter than I planned for. Walker said, Mr. Harris, you have the right to remain silent. I'd strongly suggest you exercise it. Harris looked at her, then at Anthony one final time. The kind of look a man gave when he was doing a last accounting of a board he'd spent years arranging and had just watched someone rearrange in the space of an evening. And then he nodded once to himself, or to the logic of it, or to something Anthony couldn't see, and looked at the floor, and said nothing else. Walker turned to one of her agents. Get him processed, and then to Anthony, both of you. Denver field office, 8 a.m., full statements, everything documented. She looked at Monica. Including what you found in your company and everything you were told while in custody. I want all of it. You'll have it, Monica said. Walker nodded. She looked like a woman, with the better part of 2 days of work in front of her, and the specific energy of someone's specific energy of reached this particular moment for long enough that the exhaustion and the resolution had arrived together and were currently indistinguishable from each other. She moved toward her team, already on the next thing, already talking into her radio. Anthony stood in the middle of the Meridian main floor and let the space settle around him for a moment. The portable work lights still running, the displaced gear, Harris's people zip-tied against the wall, with their professional miscalculations written plainly across their faces. The door propped open to the October night outside, cold air finding its way in. He called Lorraine from outside. She picked up on the first ring. It's over, he said, a pause. Then Vanessa wants to talk to you. And the particular quality of hearing your daughter's voice after a night like that one was something Anthony had no clean language for and was not going to try to find. Bo, her voice, hey. Bo ka on kam. Bo nghe zong như tuzi da da dang va bo. Tuzi da ka dang. Bo on, her voice climbed slightly. Kaisi ve. Bo on, Vanessa. Okay, a pause. Then Bo ka chak hom, chak chan, vu việc da song chưa? Song rồi. He leaned against the exterior wall of the facility. Con ka te ve nha. A silence long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then quietly, ve nha nghe là Denton kom. Tạm thời là vậy. Có rất nhiều thứ phải xử lý trong vài tuần tới. Khai báo FBI, thủ tục pháp lý, mấy thứ đó cần sự tham gia của Bo. Và sau đó, he looked at the sky, clear and very dark, this far from the city. The way it only got when the mountains and the distance from streetlight combined. Cold coming down from the peaks. Sau đó Ming Ting. Bo, a pause. Có người tên Monica không? Bài có on không? Có cô ấy on tot? Another pause. Bo ka sợ không? Tôi nai? He was quiet for a moment. Có tot, she said. Sợ là tot, nghĩa là Bo đang thực tế. And she said it with a directness that had no performance in it at all. Just the clear-eyed pragmatism of someone who had done a lot of waiting in a safe place and had thought about things while she waited. He pulled her into the conversation the way you pull someone close when distance is the only thing between you. Ngu ngon di. Bo sa goi sang mai. Bo kung ngu ngon chen zung tatsu. Bo sa ko. He hung up and stood outside a minute longer. Let himself feel the thing underneath all the operational calculation. The specific quality of relief that was not the absence of fear but the presence of something that the fear had been standing in front of. Then he went back inside. The 72 hours after Meridian were the administrative consequence of a night that had felt, while it was happening, like it existed outside of normal time. Federal operations generated paperwork in the same ratio that they generated conclusions. Anthony sat in conference rooms at the Denver FBI field office for 8 hours on the first day and 6 on the second, going through everything he knew in the sequence it had happened, and at the level of detail that made it useful. Walker ran the debriefings herself. She asked good questions, the kind that were built for precision rather than confirmation. She recorded everything, stopped to clarify when something was ambiguous, and when she got to the part about the drive and the 3 years of unauthorized possession, she asked her questions, documented his answers, and moved forward without editorializing, which was either professional discipline or the recognition that some conversations had a time and place that was not this one. Victor Bryant cooperated from 6 a.m. the morning after his arrest. His testimony ran 11 hours across 3 sessions. He knew the complete internal architecture of the operation, and told all of it: the financial structure, the steering of Monica's research, the communications with Harris, the timeline of how the weaponized development track had been constructed inside a legitimate company, without the founder ever knowing. The structure around her was load-bearing for something else entirely. Anthony heard this secondhand from Walker during one of their check-in calls. "His cooperation is extraordinarily detailed," she said, which Anthony took to mean Bryant had made his decision completely and without reservation, whether from conscience or self-preservation, or both, in proportions that didn't particularly matter for the evidentiary outcome. Jeffrey Lewis held out longer, until the financial documentation made the hold untenable, at which point he cooperated, and his cooperation opened 2 additional political connections, both peripheral information exchanges rather than operational involvement, that resolved into plea agreements over the following month. Anthony testified at Harris's trial on the 3rd and 4th days. 6 hours total across 2 sessions. He was a clear witness, because he did not editorialize and did not attempt to shape the narrative beyond what he'd actually observed. He answered the questions he was asked. He looked at Harris once, directly, across the courtroom. Not with hostility, not with anything he'd want to try to name. Just to not pretend the man wasn't sitting there. Harris's defense team was good. They worked the classified material angle, the shell of plausible deniability around his direct involvement, the architectural distance between him and the subjects. They built technically coherent arguments, and Anthony could see them taking purchase with 1 or 2 jurors who wanted the complexity to excuse them from the harder conclusion. But Bryant's testimony was 11 hours, and Bryant had been inside. The verdict came back on a Friday afternoon in February. Guilty on 7 of 9 counts. The 2 acquittals were on the peripheral conspiracy charges, where the defense had successfully created reasonable doubt at the specific evidentiary standard required. Walker found Anthony in the courthouse hallway afterward. 7 is enough. He's looking at 18 to 22 years. Which at 60 means he's looking at the rest of anything that matters operationally. Anthony nodded. He thought about Harris descending those stairs in Meridian with his hands already going up. Thought about what that final gesture meant about the person, and whether it was in tension with or continuous with everything that had preceded it. He didn't reach a conclusion that satisfied him. He reached the conclusion that it was probably both, which was not comfortable, but was almost certainly accurate. Some people needed their stories to resolve cleanly. Anthony had spent enough years in the space between clean and true that he'd made a kind of peace with the gap. The Integrity and Recovery Division occupied 4 offices on the 4th floor, east side of the NeuroCore Technologies building, which sat in the tech corridor south of Denver, in a glass and concrete structure that managed to project both serious and aspirational without resolving the tension between them. Anthony arrived on his first Monday 7 minutes early, and spent 4 of those minutes lost in the wrong wing before a woman at a reception. Directions that were slightly off because she was reciting them from memory while thinking about something else. He ended up in the right corridor eventually. His office had a window that looked at the sky from a different angle than the conference room at the end of the hall, which looked at the mountains on days when the air was clear enough. Today the air was clear. He stood at the conference room window for a few minutes, with the coffee he'd picked up from the place across the street, a small, serious operation run by a person who cared specifically about extraction ratios and temperature, and would discuss both at length if given the opening. And he looked at the mountains and thought about what he was here to do. Monica found him there at 8:15. She came through the conference room door in a dark blazer that wasn't the one she'd worn through the worst of it, and her hair was up again, and she looked like herself in this building, in a way that had a weight to it now that hadn't been there before. The particular weight of someone who had contested for the right to stand in a certain place and won. "Wrong room," she said. "I know," I needed a minute with the view. She came and stood beside him. Looked at the mountains, the 4 subjects. Walker's office sent over the complete case documentation last night. It's on your desk. All 4 confirmed. And a 4th who didn't know. Gloria Reeves, 55. Former NeuroCore contract employee from 18 months ago. She left the company experiencing what her doctor characterized as unexplained episodic memory disruption. She's been in therapy for a year trying to understand what's happening to her. A pause. She doesn't know yet. Anthony looked at the mountains when. That conversation is next week. Walker is sending a victim advocate, and I'll be there. I'd like you there if you're ready. I'll be ready. He went to his office and opened the case documentation and spent the first 2 hours of his first day reading about 4 people whose lives had been altered by something they hadn't agreed to and hadn't known was happening to them. He read it with the same quality of attention he'd once brought to mission briefings. Not because the skill set was the same, because the stakes were, and because reading sloppily about people who had been treated sloppily was its own form of disrespect. Donald Thomas, 61. Logistics consultant, now in a long-term care facility in Colorado Springs. His wife Gloria visited twice a week. His adult children visited less often because they found it too difficult. The documentation noted that he attempted crossword puzzles daily, which had been a practice and a skill he'd maintained for decades. He could no longer hold the clues long enough in working memory to complete the associations. He tried anyway. Anthony read that and sat with it for a long time before moving forward. Cedric Mitchell, 38, tech worker in Boulder, functioning in most external metrics, but carrying autobiographical gaps, entire periods of his own history that were either absent or replaced with constructed impressions the procedure had left in place of what it removed. Living with a map that didn't match the territory and not knowing which one was wrong. Gloria Reeves, 55. The one who didn't know yet, whose therapist had been trying to help her tolerate uncertainty for a year, without knowing the uncertainty had a specific source, who had made her life smaller and her world more careful because she'd been trying to compensate for something she couldn't identify. Anthony put the documentation down and looked at his window for a while. There was a version of this kind of work where you kept clinical distance because the distance made you effective, where you processed cases as categories and managed your own exposure to the weight of them. He'd operated that way before in other contexts. He didn't think this context required it. He thought this context required the opposite, that the people in these files deserved to be read by someone who let the material land at its actual weight, who didn't process them as cases first and human beings second. He picked the documentation back up. Gloria Thomas was 60 years old and had the particular posture of someone who had been in sustained grief long enough that it had restructured around the architecture of her daily life rather than interrupting it. She met Anthony and Monica in the care facility's family meeting room, neutral colors, plants in corners, chairs designed to be more comfortable than they looked, the whole configuration assembled for the specific purpose of housing hard conversations. She listened to everything Annie said without interrupting. He'd thought carefully about language. No technical vocabulary, plain words for a plain situation. Because Gloria Thomas had spent 14 months watching her husband lose himself, and she deserved plain. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Looked at her hands, then at Monica, then at Anthony. He does the crossword every morning, she said. In pen. He's always done it in pen. He was good. A pause. He can't anymore. He reads a clue, and by the time he picks up the pen, it's not that he gets the wrong answer. He can't hold the question long enough to work it. She looked at her, hands again. Last month he told me he was sorry. He didn't know what for. He just said he felt like he should be sorry for something. Nobody said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would help, and saying something unhelpful would be worse than the silence. He wasn't, Gloria said. He didn't do anything. They did this to him, and he's apologizing for it. Anthony held her gaze. We know that. And the people who did it are being held accountable in every way we can make happen. He paused, I can't give you back the crosswords. I wish I could. What I can do is make sure Donald has the best possible support for where he is now, and that you have support too, because 14 months of this without knowing why. He stopped. That's its own injury, and I don't want to treat it like it isn't. She looked at him for a long moment. Are you a doctor? No, then what are you? He thought about how to answer that accurately. Someone who understands what it costs, he said, when this happens to people who didn't deserve it. She nodded slowly, the deliberate nod of someone arriving at a decision. Then you can come back, she said. I don't want people who explain things at me, but you can come back. He came back 3 more times before the end of the year. Just himself, because she'd said she didn't want people who explained things. And he'd taken that, literally. And the most honest version of what she needed was someone who showed up and sat in the room and listened to who Donald had been before the crossword stories, the specificity of how he laughed at his own jokes before he got to the punchline, the particular stubbornness he applied to parallel parking without trying to shape any of it into something useful. Some things couldn't be made useful, they could only be heard. Cedric Mitchell asked technical questions. He needed to understand the mechanics of what had been done to him before he could begin constructing something coherent around the damage. The understanding, when it arrived, was not comfortable. But it was his, and there was a difference between carrying something you understood and carrying something you didn't. In their third meeting, Cedric said, I have a memory of my father's funeral. I'm 14 in it. I remember what I wore, what the room smelled like, the specific way the light came through the windows. He looked at Anthony. My father is alive. He's 71. He's in Atlanta. We spoke last week. A pause. Whose funeral is that? Anthony didn't have an answer. He said so. I know you don't. I'm not asking you to answer it. I'm telling you because I needed to say it to someone who would understand why it matters. I understand why it matters, Anthony said. Cedric was quiet for a moment. The therapist I was seeing before I knew any of this, she was good at her job. She kept helping me tolerate the uncertainty. But she was helping me tolerate something she didn't know the cause of, and tolerating something and understanding it turn out to be completely different experiences. Yes, Anthony said, they do. Understanding it doesn't make it better. No, it doesn't, but it makes it yours. Anthony leaned forward slightly. The confusion is yours. The loss is yours. Nobody can take that away from you, or decide how you should feel about it. What was done to you was someone deciding their agenda mattered more than your experience of your own life. Understanding that clearly is the beginning of refusing to let them keep being right about that. Cedric looked at him for a long moment. You talk like someone who's had their own version of events questioned. I've had a version of that. How do you push back against it? Anthony thought. About the mop with the split handle, the utility closet, and the drive behind the baseboard. 3 years of calibrating his footprint towards 0 and calling it protection. You do the thing that's actually yours, he said, the thing that isn't contingent on anyone else's version of the story. Something real and specific that belongs to you, regardless of what someone else tried to make you believe about your own life. Cedric went to Atlanta in December. He sent Anthony a photograph the day after the visit. 2 men outside a house, an older man and a younger man, the resemblance between them legible, in the line of the jaw and something around the eyes, both of them looking at the camera, with a slightly formal expression. People got when someone was holding a phone at them. No words, just the photograph. Anthony looked at it for a long time, then texted back, good. The conversation with Gloria Reeves happened on a Tuesday morning in a therapist's office on the east side of Denver. Her therapist, Dr. Kim, who had been Gloria's anchor through a year of inexplicable symptoms, was present. Walker had sent a victim advocate named Rosa, who had been doing this specific kind of work for 12 years and had not, in 12 years, made it smaller than it was, which Anthony could tell in the first 10 minutes, and which made him trust her completely. Gloria Reeves was 44. She had a daughter who was 20. She'd arranged for her daughter to be at work during the appointment because she'd been told something important was coming and had been responsible about it. That detail, the arranged coverage, the practical preparation for bad news landed somewhere in Anthony's chest that didn't have a clean label. Monica started the conversation. She said it in plain language, without minimizing and without excessive qualification and without excessive vocabulary and without corporate vocabulary that turned human damage into liability exposure. She said what had been done and why and what it meant. And at the end she said, "I'm sorry, not as a company representative. Personally, what was done to you was done by people who worked for me and I didn't know and I should have known sooner, and I'm sorry." Gloria Reeves was quiet for a long time. Then the memory problems, the gaps. Yes, the reason I can't remember the 2 weeks around my daughter's graduation last spring. Yes, she looked at her hands. Her jaw was tight. I thought I was developing early dementia. I have a 20-year-old daughter and I thought I was losing my mind. She looked up. I went to 3 doctors. 2 of them ran tests. One suggested it might be anxiety. And I almost believed that, because it's easier to believe you're anxious than to believe something is actually wrong with your brain. Monica took that, didn't apologize again, didn't argue, just held it. Gloria looked at Anthony. "What do you actually understand about this?" It was a fair question. He didn't deflect. "I understand what it's like to have someone else decide. Their agenda mattered more than your experience of your own life. Not the same way yours did, but the category of it." He paused. "And I understand that understanding it doesn't make it better, but it makes the support different. Less like management, more like someone actually seeing what it is." She looked at him for a long time. "My daughter, does she need to know any of this?" "Not right now," he said. "If you ever decide to have that conversation with her, it's yours to have in your own time and in the way that makes sense for you. Nobody will do that for you or without your say." Gloria nodded slowly. "The others, she said. "The people this also happened to. Can I talk to them eventually?" "When they're ready. Not before. I want to talk to someone who gets it from the inside." She looked at Anthony. "Start from right now," she said. "Tell me what this actually looks like going forward." He told her all of it, the specific medical support, the financial restitution, the legal process and what her role in it would be and what it wouldn't require of her. He told her about the others without naming them. Enough that she knew she was not singular, not inexplicable, not a person losing her grip on reality. A person whose reality had been interfered with by people who had no right to it. Before he left, from the parking lot, he called Walker. Gloria Reeves mentioned a man with a blue-faced watch running her appointment. During the session, he called someone and said something about the 4th subject being compliant. She remembered it at the time but didn't understand the language. Walker's response was immediate. "I'll pull the internal communications from that period. If someone was on a call during her appointment, there's a record." "Good," he said, and stood in the cold air for a moment, and then got in the car and drove back toward the building where the work continued. Vanessa's room in the Jefferson Park apartment was painted the color of committed autumn leaves. She'd described it as terracotta, which was technically accurate but missed the emotional register. The constellation stickers from Denton were on the ceiling above her bed, same ones, slightly repositioned, because the ceiling geometry was different here. She'd asked him the night she put them up whether it was strange to bring them. He'd told her it was exactly right. On an evening in late November, the kitchen smelled like lemon and parmesan and the particular warmth of a place where someone had been cooking with intention. Vanessa made pasta the way she'd been making it for 2 years. Lemon, parmesan, black pepper, all 3 in quantities that exceeded what any recipe would specify, which was exactly how it should be. Anthony came home from the day's work and hung his coat and washed his hands and sat at the kitchen table. Same table from Denton. Same slight wobble in the left rear leg that he'd never fixed because he'd gotten used to compensating. "Bo ơi," Vanessa said, setting a bowl in front of him. "Giáo viên nghệ thuật của con hôm nay nói điều gì đó hay lắm." "Cái gì?" "Cô ấy nói lý do người ta làm ra thứ gì đó chai nhạc, bất cứ thứ gì là vì họ cần đưa thứ đã ở quá lâu bên trong ra ngoài. Không phải về vật thể được tạo ra, mà là về sự chuyển giao." He looked at her. "Cần tin điều đó không? Cần nghĩ là tin." She sat across from him. looked at her bowl for a moment. Con bắt đầu ve mẹ, không phải từ anh, she said. Từ ký ức có thể sai một số chỗ, nhưng đó là hình ảnh rõ nhất con có mẹ đang cười. Con không nhớ con nói gì khiến mẹ cười. Nhưng con nhớ cách mẹ cười. She looked at him. Bố con nhớ giọng mẹ cười không? He sat with it, really sat with it. Bố nhớ hình dạng của nó. Không phải lúc nào cũng nghe được trong đầu nữa. Nhưng bố biết nó trông như thế nào. Vanessa nodded slowly, the acknowledgement of someone who had arrived at the same place from a different direction. Không muốn cho bố xem khi xong. Bố rất muốn được xem. They ate. Outside the window, Denver was doing its nighttime thing, smaller and more honest than the daytime version. The light from buildings making the shapes of things visible without the competition of sunlight. From the right angle, you could see the suggestion of the mountains. Not the mountains themselves. The fact of them, he thought about Lily. He did this every day, not as loss exactly, or not only as loss, but as the presence of someone who was not present, which was its own distinct condition and deserved its own distinct language that he hadn't found yet. The specific reality of who she'd been, the still water quality, the way her hands moved when she explained something she cared about, the look on her face the night Vanessa was born, which he could still access in complete detail, and which belonged to him, in the way that things belonged to you when no one and nothing could get to them. Nobody could get to that. It was his, and it was real. And 3 years of making himself small had not managed to take it, because the things that were actually yours didn't yield to that kind of pressure. After dinner, Vanessa did her coursework at the kitchen table, and Anthony sat in the chair by the window and looked at the city. He thought about Monica's board presentation. The moment she'd told the skeptical director that guarantees in situations like this were what people offered when they didn't understand the situation well enough to know better. The discipline of saying, I don't know, and I can't ensure that, and here is what I can actually do. In a world that ran on confident promises, that discipline was rarer than it should have been. He thought about the work that was ongoing and would remain ongoing. Donald Thomas, trying to hold a crossword clue in working memory long enough to write the answer. Cedric Mitchell in Atlanta, standing outside a house with his living father, taking a photograph as a piece of evidence that the real was still real. Gloria Reeves learning to trust the map of her own mind again. The work that didn't offer clean endings, that came back every day and asked you to come back to it. He could live with that. In some ways, it suited him better than the previous version of the work, which had required him to not look too closely at what he was building toward. This required the opposite. Required showing up and staying and doing it as well as he could without lying to himself about whether he was doing it perfectly. He was doing it. Which was the available option and the right one. Vanessa finished her coursework and came to say goodnight. She paused in the doorway. Bố đang làm cái chỗ ngồi nghỉ. Bố đang ngồi nghỉ. Suy nghĩ tốt, hay suy nghĩ phức tạp? He considered this. Suy nghĩ phức tạp mà phần lớn là tốt. She looked at him with the clear-eyed directness she'd always had. Đó là loại tốt nhất, she said, and went to bed. He sat for a while longer. The city, the mountains behind it, invisible in the dark and completely present. Vanessa's constellation stickers on her ceiling down the hall, the same ones she'd put up at 10 years old, because she liked them, carried through a move and a change, and all the small losses and forward motions that made up the interval, repositioned but intact. The things that were actually yours didn't yield. That was the thing he kept coming back to. The things that were real and specific and belonged to you, at the level where the interference couldn't reach, they held. Whatever else came, whatever else was tried, they held. He took his phone out. I took the job, he said when Brian picked up. A pause. The sound of keyboards. Neurocore, Brian said. The new division. Yes, title. We haven't discussed the title yet. Discuss the title. Organizational clarity matters. I will discuss the title. Are you... A pause slightly longer than Brian's usual rhythm. Are you all right? Anthony looked at the window. The city, the dark shape of what lay beyond it. I'm not mopping floors anymore, he said. That's not what I asked. No, Anthony said. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. I'm doing the thing I'm actually for. which turns out to be harder and slower and less clean than the previous version. And I think I'm probably the right person for it. Brian was quiet for a moment on his end. Then, Denver has a good food scene if you need reasons to stay. Anthony almost laughed. I'll let Vanessa know you have opinions. Tell her Lorraine hustles at cards. She should know. She figured it out already. Everyone does eventually. A pause. Anthony. Yeah, good, Brian said, simply. The way Brian said things that mattered without decoration, without ceremony, with complete intention. Good, he hung up, sat for another minute, with the phone in his hand, and the city outside, and everything that had happened, and everything that was still going. Let himself feel the weight of it in the way it actually sat, which was not as burden exactly. More like ballast, the kind of weight that kept you oriented when everything else was moving. Then he got up, turned off the light, and went to bed. Outside, Denver settled into its overnight quiet. Not silence. Cities didn't do silence, but the lower register, the sustained hum of a place full of people going about their lives. And somewhere beyond the buildings and the streets, and the ordinary accumulated texture of it all, the mountains stood in the dark where they always stood. Invisible, completely present, the morning already on its way.